So thank you so much for being here and continuing in the second day and almost finishing our symposium. So I hope that you are enjoying it, those who are here in person and those who are watching us virtually. So I would like to introduce our second session, the politics of visibility, where we are going to have in conversation Candice Jansen, Marianne Placir, Michelle Lisa Polisant, and Crystal Whaley. So I invite you to join us here on the stage, and I will leave you to take it over. Thank you.
This is on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel with these three amazing artists here with us today. Before we begin, I'd maybe just ask for us to all perhaps take a collective moment of silence for the suffering in our world today, for our people, and also for ourselves. Thank you. Thanks. So, how do I come to this panel? I was thankfully brought into this space and this gathering over these 2 days, which has been an incredible education and a wonderful gathering of minds and thinkers around the question of our work in photography. And I come to this through a few years of thinking and exchange with the book Viewfinders that was so wonderfully introduced for us in the film we just saw, The Sound She Saw, as well as my learning from Jeannie, who unfortunately couldn't be with us. But she will be with us through some of the video clips of our exchanges that I thought to bring into our conversation today. So I would perhaps like to start with the first clip before to help us kind of arrive at some of these important questions that are framing this conversation today. Thank you.
Another fascinating story, and forgive me for going off on this, but I remember specifically the Camera Girls Club that was nightclubs in Los Angeles back in the the 30s and the 40s. They had at these nightclubs what they called camera girls, who would go out into the social club while people are dancing or sitting at their individual tables and enjoying in the jazz club, the music and the entertainment. The camera girls would go out and solicit images of friends or couples who might want to be documented for the night. And the women would go out into the audience, and if someone wanted their portrait snapped, she would engage them, take the photograph, go back to a makeshift dark room and develop the film. And before the show was over, would present the photograph to the client. And then they would talk about the price. And in most cases, they did purchase, the client did purchase the photograph. But it was the gentleman who ran that whole Camera Girls outfit who told me the stories of how that was done. And I just thought, this is the way things were done. But let's look at all of the work that goes behind the idea of how this club operated in making clientele feel that their being in this historical environment in many ways to be documented at that time, that there were women who were photographing them and telling the narrative, not just of the story of these nightclubs, which documented a period of time, but doing it in a way that put the client at ease and making money for the club, learning a craft. There were so many components to doing this, and the gentleman who described it was very proud of what the women were learning. And what I was very aware of was it gave him pride, but I can only imagine what the women who were doing these jobs felt about what they were doing in learning a craft. And we never heard about the women who were in the armed forces who were photographing, like Louise Martin. And she was actually a newspaper photographer in Houston, Texas. But there was also a WAC who lived in New Jersey who was photographing for the Army. And she too had a very interesting role of photographing women in the workplace in the Army itself. And you'll see a couple of those photographs in the Viewfinder's book. But what was so outstanding to me about these women was their involvement in photography and their understanding of the document that was important to them in the work they were doing. And they treated it as a profession and as a way of story.
So why play this clip? Some of the founding questions for this panel, and I will restate them here for us, was what does it mean to achieve institutional visibility? What strategies can be implemented to challenge current academic and art historical frameworks? What is the role of the collective in fostering institutional recognition? How can photography help to achieve social and political goals? So I thought to bring Jeannie's perspective into the room because I thought that it opens a perspective in how we may define institutions and their recognition. The emphasis for photographers is often placed upon cultural institutions within dominant cultures that have systematic power at the expense of the power of our own communities. So we may be written out of history books, census records, art institutions, but the people in the communities knew them. To them, they were not invisible. And they were very important to their communities, and they mattered in spite of dominant invisibility. And I'm also thinking here about Mariella Bobo from Ebony Magazine talking about using your platform to open and give opportunity to others. I also thought Jeannie's reflections open a perspective of the work of women in photography, not just as artists, but as institution builders. And here I also think of Laurie Lyons in the film, who is creating her own website, NPOs, being an entrepreneur, and thinking of Black women and how they serve as institution builders in our schools, in our families, in our broader social life, as memory keepers. Because photography is an art, but it is also an industry. It is also a tool. So perhaps then to the panel, I would kind of maybe ask us to rephrase the question and think about, in your own practices, how do you reflect on the work of institution building, not in the traditional sense, but in the critical sense, through your work as storytellers, You are assembling and gathering Black women's work in photography and its cultures through your films and your publishing. Whoever would like to start? Well, Crystal, maybe you should, since we just opened.
Sure. Well, I've got some stuff written down. So I would say, first and foremost, to be curious about our stories and how they are multidimensional, as we are not a monolith, right? We have many, many, many stories. So the curiosity is part of that kind of overall humanity and that we exist. I think, too, that once we become curious and once we start to listen and hear and view and see some of those, really magical kind of multi-layered stories, that we also celebrate those stories wherever they are. I think it's important to make a really concerted effort to amplify our voices and our stories, and we can do that easily by word of mouth, in your personal and your professional spaces, to help to amplify them through your social network on your platforms, to be really very supportive with institutions and initiatives that help to amplify our work. And just to make sure that our work is living, even with our past stories, they are living within us. And I think lastly, I would say to make sure to challenge the stereotypes and the assumptions, of us, as folks will look at us as a monolith, and we are not all the same, and we are not all our trauma all the time. And to make sure that we're always celebrating our joy, our beauty especially, and our resilience. And so as a filmmaker, that's what I try to do. I'm always curious. I want to hear about the stories. I want to create some stories. I want to tell my story, your story, and her story. I want to be able to amplify your story, and just that we are viewed as a multi-layered human, beautiful and resistant.
It's funny you say, you mentioned like the monolith, because that's immediately where my mind went, was this view of especially Black folks as this homogenous community. And I always think back to the images that I guess the first historical and archival images I remember seeing of Black folks growing up. And it was always police dogs, things like, it was like either police dogs or African people in tribal wear, and this understanding that we were one or the other, even though I'm from a Haitian community, so my history is slightly different, but not that different, And so for me, it's always been about diversifying the stories and the images that we see of Black people, so that it forces you outside of the homogenizing of us, right? You can't homogenize people if there are detailed images of them being different, And although that, it's an effort that isn't always, it may feel futile, but in recognizing the kind of very white history of photography, or white written history of photography, I'm always trying to, with my work, show a much more diversified voice. And so even like something I always tell people is like, I've never seen a picture of my mother younger than like 25. And that's because my parents are from a small rural community in Haiti. But all the images I do have from my childhood are so precious to me because of that, and understanding that like I want to be able to continue the story of my family and the people around me. And so trying to use photography as like an archival tool, but also recognizing it as being just that thing, like not like, unfortunately, it's only one part of a full story, but it is a necessary part because, you know, thinking to things like National Geographic, they've been very deliberate about what images they put out of people of color forever. I mean, they've apologized for it since, but it's an apology for like hundreds of years, essentially, of this. So pushing back against institutions like National Geographic, who are seen as the, I mean, in some ways, the truth holders of photography and like anthropological histories, and although, but still so deeply connected to a specific, very white and very male lens. So I think for me, it's a lot of that, and also just recognizing like how Haiti specifically is viewed in the public sphere, and how that's so different from my experience of being somebody who goes to Haiti for vacation. And you know, people saying, like when I say, oh, where are you going for vacation? I'm like, where are you going for a month? And I'm like, I'm gonna be in Haiti with my family. And they're like, why? And I'm like, it's super chill. That's why. So creating images on those trips was such a big part of me hyper connecting to this understanding that, like, you know, like you're seeing in the news something that says there's like this mass deforestation in Haiti, and then I'm taking photographs of fields of green in Haiti, mountains covered in green. And because I recognized how deeply our stories are being told for us and are being spoken over so often, I try my best to use that as my kind of like lens for photography. I feel like I'm going on and on.
For me, so I am not a photographer, I am a multimedia artist. But I am using photography to enhance my narrative, which is about social domination and power. And by using different pictures, archive pictures, that highlights different celebrities like Josephine Baker, Aretha Franklin, Ruby Bridges, it's a way for me to not only show who they are, but the essence of who they are. It's like, you know, when you are drawing a nude, the goal is not to draw the skin or the color of the hair or the eyes, it's to capture the essence. So through the work, I'm going to, this one, for example, which is a backlight, made of different collages with archive pictures in the back. And for me, I'm trying to show the personality of Josephine Baker, the essence. But I think that the recognition, it's a metaphor for me. It's a metaphor of woman artists in any kind of fields. But it's not only capturing the essence, but the artwork. And I think that's much more being recognized as an artist. What I want to be recognized, it's the artwork. It's how we are working hard to come from one point to touch our goals and our dreams. And if this is recognized by institutions, and I think it's a great point, because I mean, we are working much more hard than an artist, a man, and I know because I am sharing a space with an amazing artist, and I saw the difference. And when I was talking with him yesterday about this symposium, he just didn't understand why this is existing, this symposium. And I told him, okay, but is there any museum for men? It doesn't exist. There is museums for women. Why? Because we are invisible. That's it, period. And it was for me very annoying because I realized that we have a lot of work to do to gain invisibility. And I think that being visible, it's also a lottery. You can work hard, be successful. So we have to define the term successful. What is a successful artist? But I think that it's a lottery in terms of how many of us is going to win to be visible. 100% women artists, how many of us is going to be visible? Because the institutions, museums, or galleries, or auctions, they are also playing a role. So we have to create a sort of schema that can bring us in front of the scene. So I don't know how we can do this, but I just know that through my work I am trying to highlight, and this is why it's a light box. I was like, how can I highlight those figures that are important in the world? It's with light. So I created backlights. So all those work, it's just a metaphor. This is Ruby Bridges, and also the sort of inks of point of inks in the pictures. It's the cells of Aretha Lakes. So it's everything has a certain sense in the work, and I don't know if you know Aretha Lakes. Okay, Wikipedia. I'm going to read it for you because it's important. HeLa is an immortalized cell line used in scientific research. It's the oldest human cell line and one of the most common used. The line is derived from cervical cancer cells taken on 8 February 1951 from Henrietta Lakes, a 31-year-old African-American mother of 5 who died of cancer in October 1951, and after whom they are named. That means this young lady in the 15 died from cancer, and the scientific corpus took the cells of Henrietta, and these cells, it was an African black American woman, and the scientific corpus took the cells of Henrietta, and the cells still exist, and they are used to cure so many cancers. So for me, it's the most impactful metaphor I can use to express the power of a black female person to enhance my narrative. So that's why all my work since a few years now are emerged by this sort of spots of inks, color spots of inks. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess invisibility, unfortunately, is productive. It perhaps offers the impetus for curiosity, for lineage, for visibility. And shout out to Coralina, who asked a very important question yesterday about what our art would look like if we did not have to respond, intervene, interject. And that's a question, food homework for myself all the way back to South Africa. But this labor, this necessary labor, which is also infused with love and celebration, I guess segues us to bring Jeannie into the room again to help us think about this question of collective effort.
Story, and forgive me for going off on this, but I remember specifically the camera girls. It's interesting that collective effort is, I think, a very important topic because while I was speaking, I was also thinking in the back of my mind about the various forms of what the collective effort has produced. And while I was talking about in Viewfinders the importance of the work of making photographs for these women who saw it as, you know, some of them bread and butter, some of them their identity. Vera Jackson, who worked for the Washington Sentinel newspaper, an African-American paper in Los Angeles, California, all of the Black celebrities of that time, Dorothea Dandridge, Adam Clayton Powell. She photographed a lot of celebrities. But what was important to her was bringing out the personality of these people who were important to the community. You have the collective effort of the women photographers who each represented a field of their own. But then the collective effort of someone like Deb Willis, who did this she's done a lot of very important books, but the book about the Civil War soldier, to add her collective effort of telling the stories of what photography meant to these soldiers and their families, what photography meant about the memory of if a soldier didn't come back home, the family had these images of their sons or their husbands who were fighting for their country, which these were stories that were not told. And with the collective effort of bringing all of the different aspects of Black life and our contributions in various parts of our world and in our country, is very evident through photography. And Deb has brought that in, as I mentioned, beauty before, in terms of memory, in terms of place, but to then bring the civil rights, the Civil War soldiers, and the importance of photography to them and to their families connects to a much more basic need of photography in the Black community. And that's the family, the love, the recognition of I exist. And that, there's so many stories to be told about the community, about the Black community, that are told through photography that are not, there's still a lot of stories that need to be told. And the collective effort needs to continue because all of the stories have not been told.
So Jeannie's reflections on the meaning of collective efforts within Black women's work in photography also sits alongside latent strategies of representing collectivity, not just through the book Viewfinders itself, but also at the end of the book. Jeannie lists more than 100 women's names from 1860 to 1980. And Crystal, you do the same in your film, in which you list the names of Black women photographers not featured in the film, but also part of this contemporary history, this collective. And I also here want to reference Adriana Waheed in your film, who collected found photographs into the Waheed Photo Archive, itself a kind of collectivity assembled for posterity. So I'm going to pose a question to Michelle and ask you how you think about collectivity and effort within your own practice as an educator and as a community arts practitioner. By the way, your website is fantastic. Please, I would encourage everyone to spend some time there. But I loved this quote by this performer who was in one of your videos around an activation you had, I think, at Basel. And the poet, please, whose name I would ask you to...
Aja Monet.
In one of your documented performers, she said that to nurture is to resist. And I loved that food for thought.
First of all, thank you for complimenting my website. I worked really hard on that. But it's great that you started with that particular performance, because I will shout out my collaborator, Naja Moon, who's in the crowd, who really was the brains behind that performance, and it was part of my role at Locust Projects is where we kind of fit that in, but we used to be part of a collective called the Black Family. And I think that kind of is, I won't say it was the start, because now as an adult, I have seeds of my own history of collectivity, right? That I can look back at. Like I have a friend who visited me for Art Basel maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And she was like, you're the reason I went to art school. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And she was like, okay, you don't remember this, but when we were in high school, we used to, in high school they do these, have colleges come visit and talk to you. But it was always junior and senior year that they would come talk to you, at a point where it's not too late, but it's kind of if you decide to now go to art school, it's kind of a major shift and a lot of work to start then, as opposed to, say, freshman year. And I used to be, and when I was starting to get those, and also I will say I went to a magnet high school, and I was in the International Baccalaureate program, and those students in IB and advanced placement programs got priority to speak to colleges. And for me, I found that very frustrating because we're also all being encouraged to go to college, but then in a certain way, in practicality, we weren't. And so I went to the administration and I was like, I think it's necessary to have everybody come to these. These should be big conversations in the auditorium and not just to the 30 or so of us in the art room at a time or in this specific space at a time, which did end up changing, and that was great. And so when SCAD came, she was able to attend SCAD's talk. She went to SCAD and the whole 9 yards, and now she's an artist and photographer and the whole thing. And so which is why it was funny when she said that, because I was like, I don't feel like that was a big thing, but I do recognize that oftentimes people are not speaking about those types of issues. And then I ended up being a recruiter years later, and the issues are everywhere. But to go back to what about the performance you brought up, I feel like in my adulthood, the Black Family was a starting point for me to kind of engage with how to create a collective voice, how to move people in a more deliberate way. And then I was working in arts administration as well. And I think that the work that I was doing with Black and with my collaborator were informing me in a more practical way, in the sense that, okay, I'm working at an institution, several institutions at this point, but I'm working in institutions and I have access to funding and support, and I'm recognizing on paper how often those things are being given to the same people. Or, we did a program at one of my organizations that I worked with where we invited visiting curators to speak, and we would always have them do studio visits. And so I made this kind of nerdy Excel sheet that counted how many times a certain name was mentioned or used or was invited. And it was certain people had gotten 5, 6, 7 studio visits over the course of a couple of years versus people who hadn't had a single one. And how, not all of them, but in some of them you can see how their CV is shifting because they're being given so many access points. And so trying to change some of who is being invited in those spaces and how deliberate we are in making choices for the curator to pick who they want to speak to, as opposed to just pushing these same names, and especially in a city like Miami where you have these amplified voices that are being lifted up regularly. And then even just thinking of like, so then years later, I was working at another institution that was a grant funding institution, and we had an opportunity, it's like long-winded, I guess, but an opportunity to kind of like speak up during like protests and things. And when that happened, a bunch of us came together and were like, okay, everybody wants to post a black square, but we don't do black square stuff actively. And so all of us, myself and a few of my coworkers, sat down and like kind of made a list of demands, but mostly was just like, if you want to post this black square, you actively need to be working on these things. And so I don't think that if I hadn't been in some ways supported in my like kind of desire to be collective and to respond to power structures at a younger age, I don't think I would have still had the fervor to do it in adulthood. And I think especially in the sense that like when your finances and your life is dependent upon an institution and this salary or whatever, it's really hard to make those, I guess, demands. But then I will say, as much as most of the demands did get ignored, we were able to create a really amazing award that gives a significant sum, I wish it was bigger, but a significant sum to social practice artists every year. And that for me was like it for me is really something that I remind myself of when I'm like feeling a little down on my like, you know, that bit of imposter syndrome that can creep in, especially as Black women or women of color. I think are constantly just like questioning our place in these spaces. And I try my best to, in all of these aspects, push a desire to invite new voices into it, while also like, I'm like a special thanks person. Like I'm like always gonna give a special thanks on a project when someone works on something with me, or like, you know, whenever there's work that's been fabricated by a friend or created or like supported by somebody, I try in every way to get them paid for their work and their support. And I think that as much as finances, I don't like to make it like the crux of everything. It's such a big part of caring about your community to make sure that they're paid for their work and acknowledged for their work. So I do try my best to speak and say those people's names as loudly and as proudly as I can whenever those things happen.
Quote Erykah Badu, call us by our names.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you for the work, absolutely. Mariella, and thank you for bringing your images into the space, because the way that I was reading your work, and specifically the No Color Lines exhibition, I thought that collectivity was such an important visual practice in the way that you were reimagining these histories and these worlds within the images that you make. So your practice, and on the plane of the visual, there was just collectivity there, front and center. I don't have a question for you, but
okay,
I thought maybe
I'm like, what
could
is the
keep
question?
reflecting.
No, I think that it's a work also that can give hope to women. I think it's important for me to, when I am in my studio, I am listening a lot of music, and I feel that I just want to create with a lot of hope and happiness, and because we are made of love, of humor, of so many great things, and even if the fight is hard, I just want to show this invisible part, which is happiness and hope, and but I think that the viewer needs to see beyond what they see, and to capture the essence of the story. I think that Josephine Baker, for example, she's my hero. But playing the role, the game of the white supremacy, she became an amazing activist. Aretha Franklin, or all those persons that I am just highlighting their figure. And I think that being an artist is just an amazing gift because we have this sort of capacity to bring back our emotion and to give them to the viewer. And I think that this is just powerful. And what I'm trying to bring through the work is the power I can have to move the audience and to move the conscience and to move people. And that's why maybe I am a multimedia artist. I think that I'm trying to find the most adequate medium to express the narrative, but also to express who I am as a black woman artist living in a man world, say, to extend the... But yes, I think that it's but in the other side, it's hard work. It's never give up. It's never give up. I think when I saw the work we have done, Miriam, Mindu, and we were at the Fine Arts School of Bordeaux together, and we met almost every 10 years, and we never give up. That's crazy, but I think that also to underline the difference between men artists and women artists, it's not the subject, I know, but even if we have those potential as an artist, we have to prove it. We have to prove it. And it's not fair, but as you said, it gives us the way that we cannot give up. It gave us more power because we have to search inside of us the constancy, la constance, consistency, and the perseverance and everything to be visible. And we are gaining in power.
So, Crystal, how do these reflections land for you?
I'm going to go back to what Jeannie was really saying about the collective effort. The collective effort is really maintaining and kind of celebrating our existence, right? So I think about in the tradition of the African griot, right, the keeper of stories, whether it be familial or community, collective community, that, and I kind of want to be careful, but I do feel as though as artists and as storytellers, and we have this artistic, amazing gift that, you know, we are obligated to tell our stories and to tell our authentic, truthful stories wherever they lie, right? And I think it's really important that we are obedient in telling it from our perspective, whatever that discipline is. So in terms of the collective effort, we are needed, we are essential, we are critical. It's urgent that we tell our stories and continue to tell our stories. And so that's how it lands with me. You know, the stories that I'm passionate about, Black and brown women and girls are at the center. And so when they are at the center and I am being dutiful, you know, in telling and helping to share and amplify those stories, then we are still here. We're going to continue to be here, and our story is a living story. That's it.
No, but maybe if I could ask us to riff a little on that really important observation that you're making around the obligation to be truthful. And that can often, that's a responsibility. It can often be a burden, but also also perhaps an opportunity for a necessary refusal of that, and that becomes risky. That becomes very risky. How do you three think about the ways that you are maybe wayward, unruly, disobedient to that burden of the ways that we have to survive?
Well, so it's interesting. So there was something you were saying that made me remind me what you were just saying, because I feel like my brain, I had two thoughts going at the same time, and then they both just like jumbled into one.
I said a little bit about us as artists, and I feel like everybody is an artist.
Oh yes,
right?
obligation.
The obligation of
Yes. So it's interesting because like when I think about that obligation, I don't think of it in like a positive or negative way. It's kind of like this very neutral space to exist in. And maybe that's in some ways like this anthropological part of my brain that's just like, it's just anthropology. And I think similarly, like I am very interested in language. I'm actively trying to learn multiple languages at one time right now. I don't know why. It's not working. It's too hard. But I grew up speaking English and Creole and reading French in the Bible. And then and so I recognize how coupled with language, photography, it creates this like overarching story and narrative that's harder to discredit, because you've got two like ways of looking at it between, and because like language, especially as a Haitian person, language carries the history. And I think a lot about languages like Tut, and I think about languages that are slowly disappearing, and how the more those disappear, the less we understand, and all we have left are the photographs. And the goals for me is to have both. But then in that same like mindset, I'm aware of, I have like a particular resistance to my images being brought into different contexts without my permission. Like for example, this is like, it's funny because I think sometimes as an other, right? As a person with several others and layers of that, there are people, especially white people, who meet you and it's like in their mind, they're thinking of all your others, they're like, she's black, she's fat, she's gay, she's Haitian. Like they're like all these things in their head. So they're using those ways to relate to the work. And so I have this image that I donated to a fundraiser years and years ago. And it's just like, it's really about shapes more than it is about the content. And it's my father and 3 of my cousins in Haiti. And it was taken on like my iPhone. It wasn't even like a really high res photo, but the 3 of them pushing a car. And the shape that they create reminds me of that image of the men putting up the flag, right? And so it's just about the shape. And I sold this work at this fundraiser, and the woman who got it was like, this photograph, she's like, they tell me this is your photograph. I'm like, yes, it is my photograph, enjoy, whatever. This is long-winded, but I'll get to the point. But she was like, I've really been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement so much lately. And it was like, this has nothing to do with that. And it's also like, and like, this isn't true, but I easily could have been like, I don't believe in that. You know what I mean? And sometimes I feel the desire to say things like that, because it's like not that like I have an issue with my photograph being contextualized in a political space. It's not that, but this photo is not political and doesn't need to be politicized. It's my family pushing a truck that broke down. And so in that understanding, and other interactions, this isn't the only one, but other interactions with my work that I've seen white people respond to, I've stopped selling images of Black people to white people. And that was really hard for my then white gallerist to understand. But for me, it was really important, because I realized that once you have possession of these images of like my family, and like I also don't photograph strangers on the street without permission. And that's coming from like the Magnum photography like agency history, right? You're taught like if it's on the street, it's legal, you know, and therefore you can take it, as opposed to like it's legal, but do I want it? Like, do I want that image of somebody that didn't give me permission, you know? And so the images that I have are all people who've given me permission in some way. Either I've held up my camera and they were like, fine or whatever, or like actively we had a conversation before at some point, and so it wasn't out of context, you know, or their family. But I still find it difficult to say sell an image of my like family members who may never be in a museum like this, who live in rural Haiti, who I can't really, you know, just like bring over to somebody who lives in a mansion on Miami Beach. Like for me, that just doesn't feel right. And so that in some ways is, I guess, a bit disobedient to the like art market and like the context of like, as an artist, you gotta sell work, you know? But I have other work that I'm fine with selling, that's like images of myself. I mean, it's still kind of weird because like a white man bought a photograph of like my body once and I was like, where's that going? You know, but it's already sold, it's there, you know, he's got it, you know, and I don't know anything about it anymore. But I think that's kind of some aspect of disobedience. But I don't think it's disobedient. I think it's just like, I'm way better at setting boundaries with my work than I am in personal life. And like, that's like an aspect of it, I think, is like setting some kind of boundaries for how my work should and shouldn't be contextualized when I'm not there.
And I would also happily encourage all of you to refuse answering this question if you don't want to either, but thank you.
It's a little bit about, you know, kind of talks a bit about trying to control the narrative, right? So, you know, the boundaries are needed and hopefully they will be obeyed, you know, but the intention is to try to control that narrative.
So I'm happy to open it up to the room. Please do state your name before your question to the panel, individuals. It's open. Should I be?
Well, I'm just going to thank you so much for your presentations. And to start, I am going to make like a simple question responding to what Michelle was just explaining. But and the question is, what is success for you? Because I think that for some artists, you want to have your work being seen by members of your community, or you want your work to be collected or be exhibited in a large institution, or you want to be represented by a gallery. So where you are seeing your aspirations as artists, and how do you deal with that?
I can start. It's a tricky question because again, what is it being successful? So it depends of each of us, I think that. But for me, it's probably a recognition of my voice, and through the work, of course, but the recognition of what I'm saying through the work and through the voice. Being part of collections, museums, because it's collections. That means it will be archives, and but yes, it's again a question of visibility. You know, being visible. That means that if you are visible, the work will be visible, and it's for me it's a voice. No, it's the ability to cry out and to have this voice understanding.
I think similarly, definitely like having access to spaces that let me be honest. But I recognize also that I don't think I was fully, I don't think I fully understood that I could make this a job when I was coming into it. I think that I was aware that there were artists, and similar to the people in the film, I was like Carrie Mae Weems was like put into my face, and like Lorna Simpson, and these certain voices were brought forward for me to recognize as markers, right? But I don't think, because I came into it just being like, it's the only thing I really want to do, aside from like linguistics and anthropology, but like I didn't want to read that much, honestly. Sorry. No, it's like not very artist of me to be like, I don't read. But sorry, I do read. It's just, I have very bad vision. It's hard to read. But like recognizing that like I wouldn't say I was like just like thrusted into it, but it does kind of feel like that. Like my career path has been very, in some ways, abrupt and sudden, right? Like when I was in college, I shadowed a Magnum photographer. Weird experience, but I did do that. And then I interned at a gallery. And then that internship turned into my first arts administration job. Just kind of was just like tumbling down a hill in a way, safely, landing very safely at each kind of juncture. And so when you ask like, what does it mean to be successful? I'm like, I think my baseline is like living comfortably, being able to be honest with my work, because I think there's also this aspect which I'm in like a different kind of collective space with some other artists, and a big conversation that's been coming up has been around these like institutional access points and milestones, and recognizing if you are in the right space. And like I realized how much privilege I've gotten over the years with being given institutional access at certain junctures, that I don't mind signing my name to things that it might be a little controversial or disobedient. I don't mind pushing back against certain things, because I realize that like, not that I'm like the most successful person in the world, but like my CV speaks for itself. I'm comfortable with where I'm at financially and with my work. And so I think that's also about maybe some of what I think about when I think about success, is being able to like, without risk of the destruction of my career, push back against institutional powers, which I realize, I knew, but I think I'm realizing more and more how few artists in my community can say they feel comfortable doing those kinds of things. Yeah.
For me, going back to what you were saying, that giving voice and making sure that our stories are told, right? So I'm a producer, I'm also a photographer, but I'm a producer for scripted and non-scripted, right? So for the scripted things, I want to see those stories. I want to see them pop out. I want to see them touch people. I want folks to be able to connect with them. For my non-scripted projects, I just want to amplify what we're doing, what we continue to do, and what we have done. And I want both of those stories, including, some of my photography work, to either inspire, I want them to anger, I want them to make you feel uncomfortable enough to make a change, to have some conversation around change. So to be successful is to make sure that those stories are out there. I know I'm only one person, I can only tell so many stories, but I have 1 million stories to tell. So I'm pushing to make sure that I can tell my stories and I can help you tell your stories. But I really want, success for me is to make sure that we exist, that our voice exists, and when we need to disrupt, that we're able to disrupt.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Candice. Because we have not heard so much about your research going from the Viewfinders publication, but I also know you have this experience with the market photo workshop, and you're coming all the way from South Africa. So I think it would be really nice to hear a little bit from your side, how maybe in a comparative perspective, what are the politics of visibility in the South African context and for photographers from this geography?
Thank you, Nina, for that question. I have to say that, as you can see there, I worked really hard to find one word to describe what it is that I do in photography. And I had to come to the conclusion that my practice as a Black, Indigenous South African is really around memory. And this is memory in its tangible sense, it's memory in its political sense, it's also memory in its archival sense. So coming from South Africa, the archive is a treacherous place, but it's also a place of necessity, particularly around the history of our liberation, which is still a work in progress. Yeah. So there's such resonance that I've felt over these yesterday and today, and these wonderful conversations that I'm having with these cultural producers here, is that we are all actually facing very similar issues. There's actually not that much unique to the challenges of coloniality because it is a global project. So I think for my work in photography is really trying to expand the language through which we can start to talk about our collective joys, but also to help us actually diagnose how we got here, because I don't actually think we've really, in my opinion, and through the way that I read the history of Black and African photography, we haven't really gotten to the grips of how we got here. I think our projects of freedom, of so-called post-coloniality has been rushed, has been arrested. So my work is really just invested in a practice of freedom, and I'm also just a photography nerd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I also say those stories have also been compartmentalized? So the context and how they are connected and how they've been influenced by each other is also a big...
Of course, you know, colonialism, apartheid, these are global systems of oppression. So, yeah, it's segregation, compartmentalizing, apartheid, apartness is intrinsic to that project.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question. How are you placing this? It's interesting in the world of globalization. In the world of globalization, in our world, how can you define your work in the globalization?
Please ask your question again. I'm a little slow.
Yeah.
How do I see?
How can you replace your work in the globalization, knowing that colonialism, of course, it's part of our identity, but it's a generic concept too. It's a generic concept, colonialism.
It's a generic context, but of course it has its tentacles touch specifically.
Yes.
Yes. So there's that tension that we always have to hold, and I'd say in particular, being again in a so-called post-apartheid context, part of the apartheid project was insularization, in which what we call South Africa today was not only withheld from the rest of the continent, but also in the world, while at the same time being a global system. Because, I mean, 1960s, the world was operating on a gold standard, so apartheid was really a global sin. So there's this way that many artists, both working contemporary and working over that apartheid period, have been continually gnawing at this, freeing ourselves both mentally but also aesthetically to think our lives through the African context, both continentally but also diasporically. That work is ongoing and very much vibrant. So it's a question of language. That's very, very important in finding ways to describe our realities in new ways. And of course, these colonial languages that we're speaking in is the first problem.
Is it on? All right. Okay. Well, my name is Z. First of all, thank you all for being here, and a big thank you to Jeannie, who, although physically not here, her labor is present. What I wanted to ask follows from the obligation to be truthful. I wanted to know, are you three actively and consciously archiving your personal practice and then you yourselves as an individual and sharing that, or at least sharing it with your family, right? Michelle, you mentioned not having pictures of your mom from when she was younger, and that's something I was just talking to someone over lunch, that I have one image of my grandparents and none of my mother until she came to the United States of America. So I wanted to know, is your being, your individuality, your presence also being archived intentionally by you all so that your context is shared?
Yes and no. I can say, like, I photograph my family and my friends and my community the most. I did a series of self-portraits for a few years that were specifically a response to me, like, becoming an adult and moving out of my parents' home, right? But I really haven't been actively photographing myself in with effort. That's not like a selfie with my dog, you know? But I will say that my community also photographs me. And I think that that's also something that I find important in the context of like collectivity as well, is like all of the ways that we have to kind of also serve each other in that. But yeah, I think I wish I was more active about like particularly photographing myself. But like if you go through my photo booth, there's lots of interesting things in there, or like, you know, there's things like that. But I do think that I want to be able to do that more in a more a purposeful way, you know? So maybe there's some other way to do that, but definitely like my family in the context of everybody is definitely happening way better in a much more conscious way, which maybe that's a problem.
I guess yes and no for me too. Like, I am always behind the camera. So, I mean, always behind the camera. I gave myself permission to actually write and direct the sounds you saw because I had friends and family who were threatening to beat me up if I didn't do it. So, you know, very happy that I finally did. And so now I'm kind of on a roll. But because I'm a producer innately, and that is one who makes it happen for everybody else, there's some documentation. Of course, some of the accolades are documentation. But I am a very big selfie person. And so I document myself in the sense that I might get on everyone's nerve, but I'm going to let you know what I'm doing, how I'm doing, what's next possibly. And just for a record of existence, of a record of what I've done without being, like, I'm very shy about saying all the things that I've done. I think that's a little obnoxious, but friends and colleagues are like, girl, if you don't say it, you better say it, right? So now I'm kind of like switching gears in a way that, you know, I'm just gonna say what it is and not feel ridiculous behind it, because it's hard work. And I've been doing this for a long time, so I am changing in that way. And in terms of images and documentation of my family is from the southern United States. We hail from Tennessee. And I had a great aunt who took all of the images and all of the pictures. So I have another aunt who's not my great aunt, but my great aunt has a place where everything is in our house. So we just pray that there's never a fire. We pray that there's never a flood. And so I'm trying to get them to understand they need to digitize these images. But for instance, I was very blessed to have 2 sets of great-grandparents until I was 11. And they had images of them as young people, as children. And so that kind of sparked my interest in image making and in telling stories, because it's always been very important in my family. So I'm coming from a long history of that legacy kind of, documenting. But I can do a little bit more about me.
And I feel like my response came from the opposite, which was like, I've only really seen young pictures of myself and my siblings, and really wanting to see more images of, wanting to ensure that there were images of like my nieces, nephews, all those, because that generation was starting to come up when I really was becoming more active also in photography.
Thank you so much for this fellowship. This is like, I think, one of the high points of my year, maybe my decade. All the people in this room right now are like really incredible. So I'm really excited this is going to be documented, and how important it is to document. Anyway, that was already discussed. My question is, first of all, thank you for the candidness of the way you're talking about these issues, the politics of visibility. We could go into lots of poetics, but I think there's been some ways that you've spoken, all 3 of you, that are just honesty, and they're about navigating. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit. I know that, Michelle touched on some of the political actions you had taken that affected younger folks. I'm wondering if you 3 could talk and maybe call out some folks that were mentors for you, matriarchs or whatever, just folks that were radical in forging your ability to navigate through these layers and the complexities of the caste system here. And I'm just gonna quickly shout out Rosie Gordon-Wallace, which is Miami's matriarch, and of course, Miss Donette, and Z. Lopez.
Okay, I'll start quickly mentioning just, kind of my history of really having interest in documenting. I come from various circles of women who demand us to be ourselves. And I mean, sometimes those requests are painful because you have to look at yourself and you have to be a mirror. But I've been blessed to be in circles of women throughout my life that demand that of myself. So therefore, I have a little bit of armor to go out in this world and disrupt if needed, like I said before, to question always, and to be completely authentic. There's a Cuban filmmaker named Gloria Rolando, who was one of my mentors, and I came to know her through a very political group called Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, and she was pivotal. My first trip to Cuba was in '94 when, we had to go through the Bahamas and all the things to get there, can have our passport stamped. And she has just, her story and the way that she tells her story as a Black Cuban living in Cuba and being a revolutionary and being a truth seeker and teller just inspired me. So she's one of my mentors. Carrie Mae Weems, of course, is one of my mentors, who I tried very hard to get her in the film, but she was super busy. But I love everything that she does because it's about a mirror. It's about being authentic and being courageous enough to be who we are through our storytelling and through her portraiture and through all of her amazing work. It kind of gave me the permission to be just as vulnerable, and in that effort of being vulnerable to actually write and direct the documentary. But I always go back to these circles of women of how I was raised, and then how I meticulously found circles and or founded or co-founded circles that would make me look at myself and be authentic. So the circles of women that I've placed myself with are my mentors.
I'll say for me, like Rosie is definitely a big mentor and has been for me since, I met her actually when I was working for the Miami Rail. Nina was organizing a dinner and was like, "Oh, invite Rosie Gordon-Wallace," and I was like, "Oh, I don't know who that is." She was like, "Oh, you need to meet Rosie Gordon-Wallace," And then I just remember like meeting her for the first time, and it was like Rejeko Hockley, Nina, myself, Rosie, sitting down on the floor eating cherries and dark chocolate, just like and listening and just kind of amazed at everything Rosie said. So like Rosie was an early mentor for me when I first was coming into my practice as like an admin, but also as an artist, and she's still somebody who as much as I wish I was better at it, but she's always texting me, to like ask me things, which is great. Marie Vickles, who's somewhere in here as well, has also been a great mentor for me in so many ways, and just like willing to like hear some of these thoughts. And then I'll say also Noelle, whose name popped up on the screen. I was like, Noelle Thierd was an early photography mentor in a way for me. But also like things like, this came up in the symposium, the Still Here symposium a few weeks ago too. It was like being on Tumblr amongst like other young Black kids, including just like that was like a space of like this like push and pull and like learning and engagement. It's where I was introduced to Terrence Price's work and like fell in love with his work. And then of course like my collaborator, again, I'll shout her out, Naja is in the room with us, and she, between Black and also just our collaborative practices that we've had together, has really informed my practice in like this kind of like pushing back against my own, I'll say like my own anxieties in some ways. And then also just there was like a point in Miami that's like, wow. I don't know why, it just got so, wow, there was this point in Miami that was like really important to me where there was Smoke Signals, which was ran by, sorry, Aja Monet and Philip Agnew, and they did like parties and performances and things, and like, their neighbors probably woke up in the middle of the night to hear like Mos Def rapping in their backyard, and then I was also working with the Black family, and I was included like all this amazing people around me. And then there was also Roots Collective, which is where the pain is coming in. Founded and created by Daniel Agnew, and he's recently passed away, unfortunately. And I think I still, I think I have this like particular nostalgia around this moment that felt like this like big, like, I don't know, like this kind of like powder keg for me, and like what I desired for my future in this art space was like it was like bouncing between these different spaces for like 4 years straight, kind of, it felt like, and having access to these people who were kind of really forcing me to think deeper about what I had access to and how I used that access, how I engaged with the other people in those spaces, and all those folks also like interchanged in that too, So yeah, it's like all of that, like all of those things have been part of like my mentorship process, and I'm sure I'm like forgetting a big one is like my mom. She was a seamstress, and so that's where my textile work comes from, is like wanting to like engage with this thing, but like I don't want to make clothes, which she probably finds very frustrating, because like she would try to teach me how to like make a shirt, and I'd be like, but now I like make funky weird stuff with sewing. But also she purchased me my first like real camera. Like I had like bought things at like thrift stores, and like I had like this old really bad Vivitar that I would shoot with, or like disposables, but she bought me like a Canon XSI when I was in high school. And I feel like having that access and also just having the access in school was really big. And also just being in community with other arts kids was like a huge part of it. For me, it was like just like talking through things with everybody all the time. Sorry, it was a lot.
I don't think I have a mentor. I don't think so. I think that I was born in the cold weather of France, and at the age of 18, 17, 18, my father decided to come back to Guadeloupe. And I didn't know anything about Guadeloupe. Just I was there just during vacations, and it was a beautiful island, and that's it. So I settled there, and I'm not from a family where people were talking about the past. Slavery, it was taboo. So, but I studied in France, and when I came back to Guadeloupe, I asked questions, and I discovered that, you know, the photographs we have in the albums were just beautiful photographs with beaches, and nothing can appear through this photography as something tragic. So, but I learned that about the Caribbeans and colonialism and etc., and I discovered that my dad was an activist, and that he had to go to France because he was an activist, and it wasn't good for him to stay in Guadeloupe, and because he was fighting against the French government. And I discovered also that my uncle was a great and big activist. And I think that this just opened my eyes, and I'm like, okay, I have to learn and to understand who I am, and this part of my identity. And I think that it became a sort of, I became an activist, simply, so I would say that the mentor was my father. It wasn't a female, person, but my father. And I discovered that pleasure was a slave name. That means pleasure. I discovered so many things, and then I started to open the narrative to the world. That was my question a few minutes ago. How the notion of colonialism could be part of the world, how we can understand this notion. And I am living in a world that I just can't understand, because I just can't. It's just because we are living in a beautiful world, and I think that so activism for me, it's just a way to be alive, I would say, and to give again visibility. Sorry, it's visibility to who I am. And so no mentors. No mentors.
And I just would like to shout out both my grandmothers whose life in service as domestic workers is nourishing my writing practice. Thank you all really for your patience, for your vulnerability, for the panelists. We are way over time, but thank you.
Hello? So we are going to take 5 minutes, and then we are going to come back at 3:05 for the third section. Thank you. and instead of universalism, a chaos world. Opacity does not obscure, it is the understanding of what cannot be reduced, a metaphorical apprehension of the island fractal's infinitude. The discussion on transparency and opacity is particularly relevant in the field of photography. Taking archipelagic thinking as a reference, I define as continental photography history the academic understanding of photography history from the geographically centered perspective of Europe and the United States, where local authors and their stories are assumed to be universal givens. This approach finds one of its most successful exponents in the book, The History of Photography from 1839 to the Present by B. Newhall. Focused on Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States, Newhall's historiographical narrative has served as a reference for subsequent universal histories of the medium. Continental photography history describes a collective hallucination that validates the grand narratives of newness, progress, and universality that nurture the imaginary of the modern colonial world. On one hand, this discursive framework embraced the invention of the camera and its innovative technological development to produce even more transparent images, fully charged with details and sharpness. On the other hand, it emphasized the explorer's method, that is, a traveling figure who believes with confidence that if the world is as yet unknown, then it at least be surveyed and hence known via photography. This collective hallucination is the conviction that photography is a practice to look at the world in search of knowledge and truth. Many of the photographs that populate private and public Western collections represent almost exclusively this hallucination, which means that our view of the world has been mediated through the lens of masculinity and whiteness. The questions then arise. How do we remap this imperial colonial politics of knowledge production? I will now introduce the panelists of this session, and I will join them at the end of the presentations for the Q&A. Grace Aneisa Ali is a curator and assistant professor in the Department of Art and Art History, Museum, and Cultural Heritage Studies at the Florida State University. She is curator at large from the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York and editor-in-chief of the College Art Association's art journal, Open. Her book, Liminal Spaces, Migrations and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora, explores the art and migration narratives of women of Guyanese heritage. Heather Diak is Associate Professor of History of Art, Photography, and Visual Culture at the School of Image Arts in Toronto Metropolitan University. She is the author of Documents of Doubt, The Photographic Condition of Conceptual Art, and co-author of Global Photography, A Critical History. And Raquel Villar Perez is an academic and curator whose practice focuses on the and anti-colonial discourses within contemporary art. She is interested in the work of women-identified image makers who address notions of migration, transnational feminism, social and environmental justice. She recently joined Impressions Gallery in Bradford as curator and is completing her PhD at the University of London. So give a round of applause for them and welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us for the last panel. We appreciate your time. The most important thing about my bio is I'm Guyanese, and so I'd like to spend the next few minutes sharing with you about the work of 5 Guyanese women artists who I've really been in partnership with and collaboration with both in my curatorial practice and in my scholarship. And we have this shared commitment to our stories. We've been talking a lot about our communal stories these 2 days. Especially for us as Guyanese women, these stories are often misrepresented or unexamined. And I'm going to share how these artists are doing two particular things. One, they're pushing back against this thing called the dangerous single story of a place. And they're listening to the image, particularly the images within their own Guyanese family archives. So I want to start with something some of you might actually be familiar with, which is the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie and her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. And in this talk, she pushes back against the story of Africa as what she calls a single story of catastrophe. And I often open my classes on curatorial activism with this talk. For those of you who are teachers, I recommend it as a teaching tool. And for me, I use it as a way to discuss this question of what is a curator's responsibility to a place. And so in the lecture, she says that the dangerous single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes, it's not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So too has Guyana been subjected to this dangerous single story. The global representation on my country has largely centered on violence, on political corruption, on poverty, on trauma, and a mass exodus of its citizens. So case in point, I've excerpted this lovely New York Times article here for you. The New York Times, they're always getting it right, you know. I mean that sarcastically. So if we just take inventory of the first couple of paragraphs, and if we just look at the visual language in the lead paragraphs, here's what we get, just in 2 paragraphs. Vast, watery wilderness, dirt roads, snaking rivers, children play naked in the muggy heat, clapboard town forgotten by time, blackouts, plague in the cities, and as my students would say, the plague has entered the chat. Right? You have to wonder when you read this, is this 21st century journalism, or is it a passage from the heart of darkness? But this is how Guyana is represented on the world stage. And more importantly, it continues to be a global malpractice. The majority of our stories about us are not told by us, which in itself is its own kind of danger. So with Adichie's words in mind about the dangerous single story of a place, I've been drawn to how the next 2 artists enter into this question. What is the dangerous single story of Guyana, of its community, of its families, of its women to be countered? And we start with countering invisibility of Guyana's Amerindian peoples. This is an ongoing portraiture series by Khadija Ben titled Those Who Remain. And Ben is based in Guyana and works closely with our indigenous communities across remote places where actually most Guyanese people don't have access to. And these elder Amerindian women, their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-great-grandmothers, whose descendants have all long migrated to countries like Venezuela and Brazil, to North America, or even to nearby Caribbean islands. And so that's what the series has in common. All of these women, their children, their great-grandchildren, all of their descendants have long migrated. But these women have either made the choice to stay or for various reasons, economic, other reasons, they're unable to leave. And they implore us to ask that when migration swirls around us, what does it mean to remain? And what is our accountability to place when we do stay? This series was commissioned for my book, Liminal Spaces, and that's a book examining the art and migration narratives of women from across the Guyanese diaspora. And so in addition to their portraits, we also feature them in their own words, speaking about their own experiences. And I want to share with you that a really crucial part of my work is sort of reframing how we think about migration and diaspora. that there are two spectrums of the migration arc. There are the ones who leave and the ones who are left or the ones who remain. And that to leave a place, we really have to reconcile that we also leave others behind. And these women, some of whom were born as early as the 1930s, have witnessed Guyana evolve from a colonized British territory to an independent state to a nation working to carve out its identity on the world stage. And their stories underscore this, that we cannot talk about the migrant self without talking about the relationship to who and what gets left. We move to sort of the other end of the migration arc, to the ones who do leave, with this work, Memories from Yonder by Christy Neptune, which is focused on Abora Calder, a Guyanese-born elder who migrated to Guyana in the late 50s and spent her years working as both a home care aide at some points and a nanny at other points. And this work speaks to the generations of Guyanese women who in the last 60 years have been part of a significant migration from Guyana to New York City. In fact, a little known fact, Guyanese people make up the 5th largest immigrant community in New York City. That's often eclipsed because we get beaten out by the Jamaicans. Therefore, it's an installation incorporating distorted photography and video where Neptune digitally weaves together portraits and text in Guyanese Patois and conversations with Miss Calder, where she alludes really to this isolation that underscores her experience as an immigrant in New York. And that isolation and invisibility can be read in the veiling and obscuring within the portraits. There's also an intentional opacity in the work, as Calder is depicted in the slow rhythmic act of crocheting a red bundle of yarn. And that amorphous object she is making is meant to be unknown. The next scholar I sort of want to ground our conversation in is Tina Kempt and her wonderful scholarship, Listening to Images, and this poignant reminder that we must also listen to the image as much as we're seeing the image. And I look at this New York Times image paired with this article, which of course conveys so much about our labor and our economy and our ecology and even our spirituality. You might notice a John D. flag on one of those fishing boats. But it also requires us to listen for what we cannot see in them. And so in conversation with Kemp's charge that we must listen to the image, I've been drawn to how the next 3 artists engage this question, that in the archives, in language, in the image, how do you listen for the silences, the gaps, the absences, the erasures, the losses, and of course, what we're here to talk about, the opacities, and particularly how they are listening to the images within their own family albums and archives to speak to their maternal histories. This portraiture series called The Impossible Speech Act by Guyanese-Canadian artist Erica de Freitas is focused on a sacred act of passing closely held family craft of baking cakes through 3 generations of de Freitas women and across 2 continents. The black and white photograph is de Freitas' very stylish, wow, very stylish grandmother who's a skilled baker that sold cakes out of her home in then British Guyana in the 1950s. And drawing on the teachings of her grandmother, Erica, and her mother, who are featured in the diptych, take turns in these series of performative actions. They're both very playful and poetic, to hand fashion face masks out of green and purple icing to make these sculptural objects of flowers and leaves. And in this work, we see 3 women that are simultaneously subjects and collaborators across geographies and across time. But from an art and migration lens, what is compelling for me in this work is how it is pushing against this trope we often see of this tension and distance and separation between first-generation daughters and their relationships with their immigrant mothers and even grandmothers. It's a trope we actually see quite often in Caribbean migration literature. I'm thinking, for example, of Jamaica Cade's story, Girl. And instead, this work frames immigrant mothers as perhaps one of her greatest collaborators, and how as daughters of Guyana, we can reach to and rely on our mothers as co-makers, as co-authors, maybe even co-bakers in both our lives and in our art making. Faria yesterday spoke beautifully about this body of work, looking for Lucille, centering her grandmother's Guyanese passport to construct an archive, which I was so honored that she allowed me to feature it in my exhibition earlier this year titled, Are We Free to Move About the World? The Passport in Contemporary Art. And passports are very visceral and charged objects. I actually have a very personal and a curatorial obsession, hence a whole exhibition on passports. And with them, as I really have come to understand, they're a great paradox, that they have the ability to grant us freedom of movement, but they also have an ability to significantly curtail that movement. And so as Faria deconstructs her grandmother's Guyanese passport, this work allows us to think through these critical questions. What can a passport reveal about a migratory life? How can it retrace a path? And one that I think is so incredibly important in the context of our conversation about visibility and invisibility is who and what determines that a life is worthy of an archive. When we were in Guyana, my family waited almost a decade for our passports. My mother received her first passport in her late 30s and was finally able to travel for the first time in her late 30s. And so if we're listening to these passports of Guyanese women, we can hear the dispossession that still exists for many women in the Caribbean today, who are not free to move about the world or who are told to wait for that freedom. And finally, we come to Suchitra Matai's monumental sari tapestry. And this work, filled with saris, was also commissioned for my passport exhibition earlier this year. Matai prints onto fabric the Guyanese passport pages of herself and her mother, and in them we are shown the departure stamps marking their contemporary migrations from Guyana to Canada to the United States. Matai then weaves, braids, and drapes those fabric passports into a sea of vintage Indian saris. It's a very deeply coded work in using the sari as both an object of migration along with the passport. What is alluded to is the long arc of history of exploited migration of Indian women brought by the British to the Caribbean to work as indentured servants. This work is both a metaphor and a monument to daughters who carry our mother's things across borders. The passports tucked and folded and hidden under these saris speak to all the things that we carry, both tangible and intangible, across these borders, and the privilege and the weight of it all. Thank you.
I pressed the button, right? Okay. I just want to say, first of all, how grateful I am to be here, and to say thank you to Aldede, thank you to WOPHA, thank you to Aware, thank you to Nina and Louise, and thank you to the Perez, and for all of you who are present. We begin with a picture. nestled inside an image of suburban sprawl, block upon block of ordinary homes, staggered along a sequence of tree-lined streets. A central photograph depicts an out-of-focus room. Two unrecognizable figures watch a small television set, backlit by the stark glow of a square window. Positioned outside the picture, it is as if we are peering through one of the many windows dotting across the reset's second image. Any voyeuristic pleasure offered by this glimpse is vaunted by the photograph's unmistakable opacity. These nearly indistinguishable forms resist understanding. Still, the scene occupies an implied solidity, resting against the mottled hardwood boards that run beneath. Order and evasion characterize Riffs on Real Time, a three-part photographic series by the American artist Leslie Hewitt. A structural, rhyming misdirection persists throughout, visible in repeated iterations, and yet each instance possesses unique differences. References to the ethos of 1960s photographic practices such as Robert Adams' The Place We Live and Dan Graham's Homes for America, which formally investigated notions of domesticity and alienation, come to mind, but with a different geometry. By contrast to the sharp lines in these practices, Hewitt foregrounds swerving, knotted passages through ephemera, thereby summoning the uncanny embedded in the very notion of home and the unwieldy instability of family as a subject of photographic inquiry. Akin to Carrie Mae Weems, Hewitt wants us to think about the limits of visibility, the power of shadows and recessed space, the way photographic light can eclipse legibility even in the moment of its revelatory flash. Or brought into relation with Roy de Carava's deliberate reticence, the turn back, moments of inwardness, the blocked scene, Hewitt similarly resists transparency. By evoking the realities that emerge from contingent visualities, Hewitt suggests ways that the meaning of kinship and relations can be rethought. Inspired by the artist's grandmother's disregard for chronological time when assembling family albums, Hewitt combines personal ephemera from her own family's photographic archive with appropriated images from 1960s and 1970s mass culture. This approach probes the cultural politics of family photography in relation to both the civil rights era and the role of the photographic medium in contemporary art. In returning to the context of the 1960s, Hewitt has described her desire to mark the distance between now and then, while questioning the effects and remainders of that earlier moment still echo in the present, how they still echo in the present. In the artist's own words, Riffs is a visual trace of the way that our generation wonders about the unfulfilled dreams of the civil rights era. In this regard, Hewitt's repositing of her family photographs alongside African-American popular culture from the 1960s and 1970s functions also as a remembering, to use Bell Hook's term, pushing beyond cliched presumptions of what a photograph is towards an awareness of how it means as material, as a subject, as a practice. Combining specificity and illusion, the title immediately signals the artist's multi-layered approach. As a noun, a riff consists of a short repeated phrase or musical pattern used as a refrain. It is designed to be catchy, to get stuck in your head, to morph in your thoughts and then loop around, reappearing when least expected. It can also be a spoken improvisation or free-form performance that plays off the subject, so to speak. In photographic terms, riffs could be understood as tapping into the timeless conundrum of photographic ontology, namely, its inherent bias towards duplication and proliferation, or in a more emphatically familial sense, generation. The genre of family photography is arguably the most common and yet most elusive. Personal images, private purposes, accumulated pictures. They are treasures that communicate a sense of belonging, intimate one's history, form the ties that bind. However, within the wider visual economy of photographic circulation, untethered to their source, family photographs often take on strange and unexpected resonances, much like a riff open to appropriation and possibilities likely unimagined by their creators. Hewitt's chosen family snapshots and their built-in opacity exacerbate this paradox. This talk is an attempt to grapple with the ambivalence inherent within family photographs, thinking through the cultural politics of family photography through the lens of Hewitt's riffs on real time. These photo-based artworks tap into the loaded potential of family photography en abîme and question their potential openness. Closer consideration of this unique body of work offers a means of gauging the multivalent capacity of family photography and suggests ways such images might expand the notion of family and further question the domesticity of we. Hewitt's project embodies the effective registers of Black family photography described so eloquently by Tina Kampt. By accounting for the materiality and haptic qualities of the image, in addition to the visual, one wants to run a finger down the crevices of the floorboards, touch a dog-eared page, smell an aged manila envelope. An evocative and compelling grasp of the possibilities offered by family photographs and the relationality between people and pictures expands. Certainly, the conceptual underpinnings of the photograph share much in common with the notion of family. Photography, like family, is a mutable, shifting entity, often shaped by nostalgia and longing, influenced by deeply intimate specificities, and yet able to circulate well beyond its origins. Hewitt's photographic practice contends with the shared space of photography and family, creating works of art that are literally and figuratively layered. Each work consists of a tripartite structure containing 2 images and a base. A family photograph occupies the center as a focal point. A second appropriated object flattens the picture, and a chosen ground provides a further reminder of the work's unavoidable materiality. These 3 parts are rephotographed together as a group, compressing 3 individual frames within a single new photograph. In Hewitt's own words, she wants to know how to expand a form which compresses. Each grouping might be seen as a kind of family of sorts, replete with snapshots of family picnics and various ordinary living room interiors, layered over images appropriated from broader circulation, whether that be magazine pages, a letter, or a book. Each piece includes visible signs of wear and tear, and each photograph reveals the marks of time spent passing between hands or being sun-drenched from display. Frequently, though not always, pictured atop hardwood floors, they are to be read against the grain. According to Hewitt, these photographic works, and I quote, create new conversations about the role of photography in our interior and exterior worlds, asking, and I'm quoting the artist again, where do they meet, conflict, and come apart? Trained as a sculptor, Hewitt's preoccupation with the intersections of space, duration, intimacy, and displacement is integral to her photographic projects. With a palpable physicality, Hewitt's artwork summons the 3rd dimension from various angles as a means of analyzing the necessarily enmeshed lives of the civil and the familial, the commercial and the discrete, and moreover, the blurred distinctions between historic narratives and private memories. By exploring the constraints and possibilities of snapshot photography, Hewitt's work investigates the currency of family and accumulated imagery in relation to the spectrum of the personal and the popular. And I think this piece here, for example, which shows the interior of the African Memorial Bookstore in Harlem, which was founded by the self-taught archivist Louis Michaud, is an excellent example of this very physical and monumental manifestation of intellectual collectivity and relations that Hewitt is interested in. Her insistence on the word real, as in real time, furthers Hewitt's sculptural approach to image making, and her desire to involve the viewer while concretizing the oblique visual experience of photography. An earlier work, untitled Capsule, further evidences Hewitt's underlying interest in the entwined lives of personal and historical narratives. Containing 76 first and second editions of Alex Haley's monumental novel, Roots, on a Cypress Shelf, the tattered covers of each volume reveal the experiences of being read, of an individual life led, and yet collectively they remain grounded together within a shared space. The diasporic nature of photography invokes a similar imperative to be read. Campt refers to this process or invitation to be read in reference to photography by way of Stuart Hall's Politics of Reading. This formulation is useful in connection to Hewitt's practice as one that engages in images perpetual inscription in multiple historical contexts. Though untitled Capsule is at first glance a sculpture rather than a photograph, thematically it functions like a photograph, as a capsule of time, and in this case, one that signals intergenerational roots directly. The analogy of the winding roots of a tree has long been associated with the notion of family, with branches representing descendants. The recurrent motif of wood in Hewitt's practice, whether in the form of a box or a set of floorboards, points to an additional awareness that fragments might be cut off and transformed from their origins. Riffs on real time enacts an associative logic. Take Riffs on Real Time 2 of 10, for example. This work expands the parameters of the inside-outside public-private dichotomy as it continues to radiate out of the nexus of family, familiarity, and familial dispersion, and emphasizes that we do not simply have relations, we are relations. Ebony Magazine's 30th anniversary issue appears as the middle layer, featuring 30 covers, albeit 4 are nearly fully eclipsed by Hewitt's elusive black and white family snapshot. Here, Ebony uses a modular grid to present an array of its covers on the cover. It may in some ways be viewed as a leitmotif for Hewitt's broader practice, as it too forms a time capsule that collects, compresses, and recollects multiple narratives within a single self-reflexive frame. The various iterations of blackness contained within Ebony and its sister publication, Jet, created a valuable sense of belonging, familiarity, and community, and continue to do so, especially in relation to the social and political upheaval of the 1960s and 1970s. The magazine's photographs, articles, and advertisements offer a portal into that history, all the more interesting for the way they simulate and attempt to representationally reconstruct it. Covering content as wide-ranging as political news, fashion, and everyday human interest stories, Ebony frequently embraced family as a subject. Okay, so some of my slides are cut off. I don't know why. This didn't look like this before. For example, with covers featuring the families of Muhammad Ali, Dick Gregory, they're missing, Sister Sledge, and Diana Ross. This oscillation between subjects within its pages, including stories that engage home life, popular culture, and civic engagement in tandem, mirror Hewitt's compositions. The single snapshot in the center of Riffs on Real Time 2 of 10 is particularly difficult to read. It seems to be an interior emptied of people. Or do we see the crown of a head in the lower left-hand side? What is this a photo of? Eerily lit by the glow of a small television set, closed blinds on the window and door are visible, as is a chain lock. These small defenses against the outside, which enters here only through the uncertain content on the screen, connect back to works such as Riffs on Real Time 5 of 10 that we looked at the beginning of my talk. The shot is taken in an off-kilter style, reminiscent in tone and angle of photographs from Robert Frank's The Americans, also a raw portrait of a nation that questions belonging and domestic politics in tandem. Frank's restaurant, US 1, leaving Columbia, South Carolina, for example, shares the vibrating light we see emitted in Hewitt's piece. But it is also the blinding glare of Ming Smith, or as Arthur Jafa has dubbed her, the master of the blur, and the only female member of the Kamwenge workshop. Hewitt's personal pick resonates here foremost for its screening effect, its simultaneous lack of privacy or disclosure, as well as its engagement with the mediated surfaces of photography itself. Turning once again to the featured issue of Ebony, the cover tells us little about its contents. Tracking down the original publication, various measurements of the political and the social building up to this moment in November 1975 are included, such as reprinted coverage of the 1963 March on Washington, the stage of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most renowned speech. This story is positioned beside an advertisement for Maxwell House Coffee, showing a scene which explicitly celebrates the tenderness of family photography, thereby drawing a tacit connection between the massive gathering on the right-hand side and the domestic moment on the left, between public action and personal memory. Together, these images combine in a nostalgic twist. The tagline, "Sweet memories and a good cup of coffee," underlines the sentimental image in the advertisement. A closer reading of this advertisement provides clues as to why Hewitt may have selected this particular issue of Ebony. No fewer than 5 family photographs surround the central couple, a framed, tender wedding photograph, and numerous other individual portraits hang on the walls. On the table, beneath the symbolically clasped hands of the woman and the man, 4 more snapshots spill out from beneath an open family album. The text reads, "The ring is still beautiful, and the children have all grown up and started families of their own. The years you spent together have made you very happy, and so has that special cup of coffee. Instant Maxwell House." The instantaneity of the coffee collides with the wistful pull of the picture, and the pictures within the picture, and the grounding force proposed by the instant of photography. One more meta frame within the frame of photographic and social experience. Placed alongside the story of the biggest protest march, the couple on the left becomes the family unit upon which the multitude on the right is based. Never before had so many gathered for such a cause, reads the attendance typescript with the news story. The myth of the instant of photography and the sentimentality attached to its indexical function are put into tension with news stories and advertisements, asking for collective memory itself to be taken to task, as a prompt to think critically about how historical narratives are told and how they gain or lose salience. Within the same 1975 special issue of Ebony, culled by Hewitt, the theme of family photography appears with remarkable frequency. For example, in a cheery ad for Polaroid promoting the new Supercolors. Pages later, and perhaps more poignantly underscoring Hewitt's specific interest in real time, we find a Coca-Cola ad. Imaging and imagining a crowded, joyful family gathering, which reads tellingly, "For the real times." Cumulatively, the instability of photography, of family, and of real times are simultaneously suggested and refuted by way of reference and interrelation. After all, the vulnerability of sharing is an act that risks indifference. Recall that while Roland Barthes described photography as an umbilical cord, he guardedly refused to share his own cherished photograph of his mother, even while he indifferently, within the pages of Camerlicida, discusses this family photo by James Van Der Zee at length. This marks the tension of how it is not just identification of a subject that is at stake, but also identification with it. Take, for example, the repeated pictures of backyards in Riffs on Real Time, and the dominance of lawns by contrast to people. One displays a faded black and white photo of just such a nondescript yet familiar space with a lone figure standing on the right-hand edge, gesturing towards someone beyond the frame. Another shows what looks to be a family gathering, woven plastic lawn chairs, interactions between individuals. The former photograph appears against the backdrop of an idyllic waterfall with a rainbow arcing overhead, branches winding through the foreground, while the latter photograph possesses the monumentality of form and movement reminiscent of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, presenting a protesting crowd filling the page, advancing across the image. The momentum of solidarity here reinforces the feeling of solitude in the previous image. At first glance, tension between the leisure implied by the lawn chairs and the intensity of the throng between sitting and moving is striking. Upon second reading, there may be a suggestion that community impetus takes on multiple configurations, and that the domestic familial unit, what happens around the kitchen table, for example, plays a key role in shaping such an engagement. Frames within frames structure these pieces, and meta-commentaries on the nature and culture of photographic imaging appear throughout. In one faded print, a wooden end table appears, accompanied by assorted household decorations atop its surface. Next to a lamp, a portrait of a young African-American graduate dressed in cap and gown distinguishes itself in this mise-en-scène. It stands as a focal point of the piece, displayed proudly on the top shelf, staring out as a beacon of achievement. The simultaneous hopefulness and nostalgia summoned by this image seems to be contradicted by the view of the outside world, which provides the underlying layer. Billowing smoke and fire rise out of a blazing industrial building, and the shadows of the firefighters with extinguishers are visible along the lower picture plane. The location is indistinct, but the suggestion of peril is clear. Another layer beneath, the heavy vertical grain of wood rises, revealing multiple knots and rings, as well as darkened gouges, further marks of use and time. Possibilities for narrative invention are endless in Hewitt's series. However, the path and sequence of connection is obscure. Viewers are challenged with threading the story across one's own relations to place, to event, to object. As Deborah Willis's scholarship demonstrates, photographic representation and its affecting links to memory are critical to the struggle for community, connection, equity, and justice. Sharing family photographs beyond one's own family, or in Hewitt's case, exhibiting private images publicly, mobilizes a new register of negotiations. Hewitt implicates viewers in their associations with race, class, politics, and any number of either fantastic or mundane narratives via a labyrinth of visual and material information that defies any expectation of seamless cohesion. With the poetic concision of a haiku, Hewitt's project balances memory, social discourse, and personal meaning, lending itself to what Sarah Lewis has described as a capacious gaze. In contrast to the entrenched power structures of the white gaze, this mode of looking insists on opening spaces rather than policing borders within and without the image. And yet, these photos are neither transparent nor easy. Open, and yet crucially opaque, they resist and contest understanding. Politically speaking, this is a refusal which relates. In this way, Hewitt's re-photographed assemblages purport and deny singularity, asking the viewer to look beyond the surface of any given image, by extension questioning from the outset the familiarity of we. Thank you.
hold on a second. How does this work? Oh, is the play? Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Well, hello everyone. Thank you to the teams of AWARE and WOPHA for organizing this gathering and for inviting me. I'm really humbled to be here, and also thank you all for making it to the end of these very intense 2 days. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss family albums in relation to the work, the Counter Family album by the art collective Les Exiliades. But before I start unpicking this, I want to contextualize the origin of family portraiture. Professor Marianne Hirsch places the roots of the modern family portrait in Renaissance portraiture, which, I quote, for the first time represents the family as a self-contained institution. In the image, we can see the portrait of the Van Kampen family in a landscape by the famous Dutch painter Frans Hals, made in 1624. We see a fashionably dressed couple with her 9 children, all portrayed in a joyous way. Only the father figure looks forward to the viewer, and the youngest child in the left down corner, who I learned was added to the painting later by a different artist. The rest just look away. In photography, early commercial studios produced family photographic portraits to mainly wealthy and middle-class consumers from 1850s onwards. With the evolution of the medium and the apparition of affordable photographic cameras, family photography quickly widespread, and today, with the use of smartphones, it is everywhere. And I'm going to show what I mean with a common example. This is my family. In the photograph, you can see me, my partner Chris, and our baby Noah. We are happy, or we seem to be happy. This was taken on Saturday as we were about to take off to come to Miami. In these next ones that were taken on Sunday, we were just strolling across Little Havana here in Miami as we were enjoying our holiday. You can see we are on holiday. Yeah, true, I'm also here for work. But as a family, we have come to Miami on vacation. We are happy, we are being a family and doing family things. We meet all contemporary familial conventions and demonstrate this when posing for a snapshot. We are a happy family, a heterosexual one. We are on holiday, connoting that we have some disposable income. Perhaps the only one thing that makes us stand out a little is the mixed race nature of our family unit, but even that today is not even that uncommon. We do family things, and we show that we're a family and do things as such. The scholar Mette Sandberg sustains that the family album is a space of discourse formation, dominated by celebratory occasions such as weddings, birthdays, and vacations. When in front of a camera, we perform our best self in a way we want the rest to see us and remember us. The poses seem to adhere and even celebrate social conventions, and I recall Professor Hirsch again, who said, and I quote, that when photograph ourselves in a familial setting, we respond to dominant mythologies of family life. After years of constructing family portraits in her high street studio, the British photographer, writer, and cultural worker Jo Spence came to believe that the private uses of photography in family albums are visual constructions that do not represent the self. With her project, Beyond the Family Album, made between 1978 and 1979, the artist turned her gaze upon herself and showed how she was seen through the lenses of others, such as her father, her grandfather, her school photographer, various boyfriends, and professional colleagues. The artist combined archive images, contemporary photographs, mostly of herself, as you can see in this image, and extensive text describing in detail what the images couldn't show. For instance, her parents' working lives, her misery, and ill health as a wartime evacuee, and the deterioration of relationships, just to name a few. Spence put her own performance for the camera under scrutiny and then decided to pose once more in a raw, more honest, and comfortable relationship with the mechanical apparatus. Power and control of the image are at stake. When we are photographed in the context of family photography, we fabricate ourselves, as I mentioned. in a way that meets social expectations. That relationship of power and domination can be read in the looks that circulate in the image. It is traversed by emotions, learned behaviors, and unconsciousness. With her project 7 Years, made between 2001 and 2004, the Ireland-born UK-based artist Trish Morrissey exposed the psychological tensions hidden in the family album. The artist worked with her elder sister by 7 years, and this 7 years is what gives the title to the project. They drew from their family album and reenacted the photographs within it. Both women appear styled in a variety of wigs and costumes that remind of the 70s and 80s. They pose in different locations, supported by carefully sourced props. This project is witty in nature, and these familial yet fictional mise-en-scene scenarios prompt the viewer to interrogate their own family albums. The British queer artist Johnny Briggs deconstructs the family album by actively tearing it apart. The artist particularly works with images of his father, who played a major role on the heteronormative upbringing and socialization of Briggs. In Insight, made in 2022, the artist's ear bursts through a photograph of his father as a child. The ear intrudes the image through the location of the third eye, which in Hinduism represents perception beyond ordinary sight. Briggs attempts to listen to the past from a position of empathy, potentially trying to understand his father's beliefs and behaviors. The many dark, stark frames confine the figure, symbolizing his feelings of restriction within societal expectations surrounding his gender and sexuality. These are cut open by the ear, also removing the mouth. The only option left is to do active looking and listening. The last example is a project that the Photographers Gallery in London took on 2016 and 17. It was an ambitious 40-week digital photography project titled Family Photography Now. It explored the concept of contemporary family, inviting people to share the myriad ways in which a family today can be made up. And I think the technicians are going to help me now to scroll through. That's great. So they received around more than 3,000 submissions, and the photographs were separated in some sub-themes that you can see on the slides, and remain archived on the gallery's website. So this is the gallery's website. Despite the overwhelming response from the public, including submission from people from the global majority and queer families, the visual grammar of the family snapshots were very much the ones we are used to recognize, triggering what Marianne Hirsch dubs an affiliative look. That is, when images of vastly different cultural origins still function as a mirror of our own family representations. This affiliative look is only activated when we look at the family photos of others. For us to see, others have to intentionally display and make accessible their collection of images. In 2007, in her essay Displaying Families, sociologist Janet Finch equaled in importance the ideas of displaying and doing family. In her text, doing family means actioning the thing that families do together. And display is the process by which individuals and groups of individuals convey to each other and to relevant audiences that certain of their actions do constitute doing family things, and thereby confirm that these relationships are family relationships. Basically, the idea of display has to do with seeking recognition and legitimacy, and I quote, "Relationships need to be displayed in order to have social reality." And according to the scholar, more so, same-sex intimacies and families of choice. But then I wonder, can an affiliative look be activated when the performance in front of the camera isn't the one we viewers are used to see? Can it be activated if there is a very scarce number of family photographs available for us to see? Should we viewers try to identify and understand the absences within family albums? Can we, family of all sorts, return to some sort of privacy where we won't feel the need or desire to visually broadcast our lives in the search of recognition? So the Counterfamily album by the art collective Les Exiliades is a collection of situations, experiences, exchanges, and photographs that memorialize the emergence of the family of choice. Their work starts from inhabiting spaces and activating them in different ways to what had been planned for, and it is informed by the diasporic experiences of sexual dissidents. Community is at the core of what they do, as well as the erotic and the romance effective. It all from a migrant, anti-colonial, anti-racist, trans-feminist, and queer lens. Las Exiliades, that we can see on screen, was born in Barcelona in 2020, Barcelona, Spain, 2020, and it is composed by Diego Posada from Colombia in the far right, I think, Lisette Nin from Dominican Republic in the center of the photograph, and Jorge Sanchez from Puerto Rico in the left. With Counterfamily album, Les Exiliades subvert the traditional model of family album and its conventions that reproduce the normativity of the sexual and affective realms of the heterosexual family, generally intersected by nationalistic, colonial, capitalistic, and racist ideologies. In this first Polaroid from their album, we see a content enough male-looking individual reclined on a bed and looking directly to the camera. They wear a red t-shirt and trunks. They hold another Polaroid in their right hand. The colors and elements of the held image match those of the one we're looking at, implying that the sitter and the photographer have had a few attempts at taking the perfect photograph. The scene suggests complicity, perhaps even intimacy, between the subject and the photographer. We know their name is Joel and that they are lying on Les Exiliades' bed. We don't really know what's the relation between Joel and the photographer. We don't know what has happened before the photographs have been taken or what happened after. But we can only guess that there is an element of confidence from Joel towards the photographer as they pose, and of care from the photographer towards Joel as they try to take the best portrait of Joel. Les Exiliades often use Polaroid photography, and this is purely my interpretation. The instantaneous nature of these photographs perhaps talks to the rapidity with which migrant and sexual exiles form communities of kinship, care, and support. In here, we see Lisette at the center of a three-way French kiss. The other two figures face away from the camera as they engage in the kiss, and I won't dare to sexually identify them. The title, Linguiteo Pandemico, Pandemic Kiss, unashamedly challenges the household mixing rules imposed during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. In Angie en la casa con las luces más románticas, that translates Angie at home with romantic lights, made in 2022, we see what looks like a female figure sat on a chair, blurred. They are dressed dark tea and light shorts. They look down. The image presents a red filter, which according to the title, creates an ambience for romance. In here, I'm interested in the dizziness of the image as a way of obscuring the visual representation of Angie, which along with the fact that only the first name is shared in the title, the photograph maintains a level of anonymity and privacy that prevents the viewer from unpicking the role of this member of the chosen family by Les Exiliades and activating the affiliative look as per Marianne Hirsch. Similar strategy is used in this next photograph when we see the modeling up of the image. In this case, the figure is that of Andrés, captured in Barcelona in the studio of Les Exiliades. We can only see their blurred face and bare torso. Their left side merges with the background of soft, warm pink undertones. Queer people from the global majority, Latin American in this specific case, living in exile, whose lives will be in danger should they ever go back to their home countries, are subject to an extreme twofold hypervisibility, and is that of being black or brown and queer. There is a social expectation that they must keep revealing their identities in a way the rest of us can understand and also display themselves. The Counterfamily album attests to what Gayatri Gopinath, dubs as aesthetic practices of queer diaspora, which function as archival practices that suggest alternative understandings of time, space, and relationality generally obscured within dominant history. The absence of images in the Counterfamily album, and I say absence because I shared 5 and I only have 13 to share with you today. So the absence of images, the visual strategies of concealing the identities of photographed family members are just but enunciations of les exiliados and their chosen family's right to opacity, as theorized by Edouard Glissant. The right to opacity appeals to differences not being translated and made transparent to fit into the governing hegemonic epistemology, but rather just to be opaque. It's their choice to remain obscure. Edouard Glissant invites us to understand opacities from the textures of the weave and not the nature of its components. In his view, opacities coexist and converge, weaving fabrics, and it is in these fabrics where Glissant locates absolute freedoms. When I initiated my research into the Counterfamily album, I was intrigued by its rebel character and difference. From conversations with les exiliados and some long thinking around the project, I understand that I wish to come to the Counterfamily album from a happy position of not knowing. The description of the images I showed are just my I don't expect them in terms of los exiliados. I don't expect the les exiliados to perform family in front of the camera, and I don't expect them to make images available for me to see. The weaves and textures of the Counterfamily album, quoting Glissant again, are in the conversations we have had and have, the text messages that we've exchanged and still do, and the spaces that we share. Thank you.
So yes, thank you so much for the presentation of the 3 of you. That was so, I have like too many notes. And well, this will be a conversation in a Q&A, so I am going to start because I have too many questions. So I have, I think that 3 main ones, and then we can also share with the audience, and I want you as well to interact, because at least from my perspective, this is like an ongoing process. I don't know how have been in your cases, but I started to study or to be more interested in archipelagic studies since last year, and intersecting that with my understanding of photography, and it still is a knowledge that I'm in the process of articulating. So having this conversation is part of that. So yeah, it's nothing that I have like a conclusion. I just wanted to be part of that process. So for starting our conversation, to begin our conversation, I would like to emphasize that we are no artists in the sense, for example, contrasting with our previous panel, where we have the approach from a more, from the perspective way of the creators. We are all art historians, curators, art critics. So I would like to ask first, what do you consider is considering that you, Heather, for example, and Grace, you are both professors, how do you evaluate the current status of photography education? And specifically, and maybe in this case, Raquel can speak a little bit about that, are we seeing a more presence or visibility of Black and Indigenous voices in museums and galleries? And is that fact being translated in the classroom?
Well, I would say, okay, so as far as the status of photography in education and the inclusion and even foregrounding of stories of Black and Indigenous photographers and women or non-binary photographers, absolutely. And I think, you know, for myself, it is not only about the artists or the photographers, but also the theorization of it, coming from voices that are not white. And I think of this because, you know, in terms of family photography, there's been a lot of conversations, especially since the 1980s, about the meaning of family photography and the vernacular. And I think Marion Hirsch's example is a good one. And her writing about the affiliative look. But I would actually say that, you know, bringing in someone like Glissant, that this runs counter to Hirsch, that it problematizes the presumption of affiliation, right? And I think that that's a really necessary intervention. So in the work by people like Tina Kempt is, of course, exceptional example that have really asked us to rethink the way we talk about photography and the authority of certain writers who've had a lot of space, like Roland Barthes, right? That, you know, people have treated Camera Lucida like it's almost, especially since he writes in a personal way, as if you can't argue with it. But actually, there's so much to argue with there. And Sean Michelle Smith is another person who's really taken him to task for his sort of white male hermetic view. So yeah, absolutely. These are crucial conversations in terms of education at present. And I would also say that even in forums like this, I mean, what you've organized here is precisely that kind of intervention. Yeah.
And do you, I mean, from your perspective, this kind of knowledge is being taught in the universities right now?
Yeah, I mean...
In the photography programs of the university.
Well, in my photography program, yes. I mean, I'm not going to say that I can't speak for everywhere, but...
Well, to your question about who's spoken about in our photography classes, I think, of course, it depends on who's teaching the class, right? It depends on, and if we're talking about education in terms of the university classroom, it depends on who's the faculty there. What I've been finding, I'm in this very, pardon my pun, liminal space of being in two departments, both the Department of Art, which is an MFA program, and Department of Art History, which is a PhD scholar program. And what I found is that the Department of Art's MFA program is much more pushing the scholarship on photography and people of color than the art history program. Because the MFA art program is actually getting into the weeds, for example, the politics about lighting people of color, right? Then the PhD art history program is getting into. And so it's, for me, from my perspective of being split between these two very different departments and ways of thinking about photography, is that the making and production and teaching the making and production of photography is actually pushing the envelope more than perhaps the scholarship side, because the scholarship side seems to be a bit behind the production and the making of it.
Raquel, you have any comments, maybe from the perspective that you are currently studying, doing your PhD?
Yeah, actually, I was, as they were, my colleagues were talking, I was thinking of the context of Spain, which is where I'm from and where I did most of my studies, and the UK, which is where I live and where I'm doing my PhD. And having lived in different cities in the UK, I can sort of say that, you know, these sort of conversations and changes in the curriculum are definitely happening in London universities, but not so much in peripheral cities and universities, which is where I live now. And similarly, in Spain, I think these additions to the curriculum are happening from institutions like the MACBA, that is the Museum of Contemporary Arts in Barcelona, or Matadero in Madrid, where there's been these informal settings that bring all of these voices that haven't been included in the curriculum, and changing the curriculum in Spanish universities takes forever. So I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, going and expanding a little bit more on your response, Heather, can you make reference about what does Caribbean, taking as a reference this notion of opacity as developed by Glissant, how would you frame the significance of incorporating Caribbean intellectual thought and its potential contributions to photography criticism?
How would I frame Glissant's contributions to photography criticism?
Yes. What is the significance that you find on that?
Well, okay. So a number of things. I think that it brings out an interdisciplinarity to the field, and also importantly that's part of taking it away from being exclusively about art. Right, and also being engaged with other kinds of archives, and in the case of our panel, I think familial archives are key, and to bring out the question of the diaspora, but also, and I think this is, one of the beautiful things about Glissant's writing, the spaces of potential overlap, but that are never static. Right, when he writes about this archipelago of relations, he often describes them as wavy lines, and I think that's so gorgeous. And to think about it, and you can think about that in a reference to water, but particularly to this aspect of movement, so that relations are never fixed. And I think that is so useful in terms of thinking about life, but in terms of photography specifically, because it is a medium that for a very long time was received as being fixed. And the work of talking about it as unfixed, as a theoretical project, as an artistic project, has been ongoing for many decades. And it's just essential, because that is the movement against its role as, objectifying. And I think that's really crucial. And Glissant is a beautiful way to tap into that.
You want to comment?
There's a wonderful Trinidadian artist, Christopher Cogère, and he has this beautiful quote and question when he talks about the Caribbean, and he says, what does it mean to live in a place designed for others to play in, right? And the Caribbean, not, of course, from an internal point of view, but from a global point of view, is still a space, this paradise space where other people come, they play in, and they leave. And that quote really haunts me, because I think if you live there and you understand that is the global gaze on the place that you live in, that it's paradise and a place for other people to play in, then you begin to realize the importance of a kind of withholding and a kind of purposeful opacity. And I think Glissant gives us that permission to say, as Caribbean people, we are allowed to choose what we give to global culture, and we also are allowed to choose what we withhold from global culture. And you might recognize some of the works that I chose to talk about. You saw that withholding, you saw that obscurity, you saw that masking, you saw that barely visible, somewhat visible gestures in them. And for me, I read that as a wonderful connection to the right to opacity, and opacity as a form of resistance, particularly when you come from a space that the world sees as a consumerist space, right? A tourism space.
So in my case, I look at photography as well and its materiality, and researching the work of artists from Latin America, particularly Mexico and Venezuela, who expand from the bidimensionality of the photograph and into three-dimensional realms to, formulate discourses around mobility, migration, etc., etc. And to me, that is a way to stand against photography as it was formulated by the West in its origins, and a way of appropriating it and making it work for them. And that connects a lot with these ideas of, staying inaccessible, or like not being transparent entirely and remaining, slightly opaque to the broader audiences.
Yeah, and when I mention that is because, for example, in the case of Grace, you are working with artists that are in this, we can say like intersectionality of Latin America, Caribbean. I mean, that discussion where we may find evident or appropriate to bring into the discussion like theories that may respond more to the region, or that can render visible those voices that were for so long have been not recognized. But maybe in the case of Heather, where your presentation deals with an artwork that don't necessarily respond to the region, I would like to emphasize the theoretical aspect of this conceptualization, of this understanding of the world that Glissant is providing. That when we speak about the archipelago, or when we speak about islands or about opacity, not necessarily it goes attached to a specific territory, but also becomes a way of thinking and a way to a methodology that can be implemented to what is happening in other places, or that can be applied to other artists. Also, if you want to, I think that your presentations did very well in explaining those poetics of opacity, and you highlighted how, for example, when an image is out of focus, or the case of the relationality that we can see, for example, in the work of Leslie Hewitt, or as well this notion of working, you all together as well have in common the notion of working with family archives. But if you want to emphasize a little bit more for all the people that are here that maybe would like to have like that note about how can we define those aesthetics of opacity conceptually or maybe formally, how we can see that through the work of the artists that you address in your presentations.
Okay. Well, I think that one of the things that draws me to Hewitt's work is its sheer difficulty. Like, you think like, oh wait, is this just poor resolution? No. Like, why does the image look like this? And I think even that visual texture is really curious. Her sensibility of these layers, these multiple layers of reference, which on the one hand expands the possibilities of associations, and is quite poetic, and all kinds of historical touchstones. But on the other hand, you can't follow. Right? Even the fact that there are 3 series, sets of 10, all with the same name that from different dates, like like it really is a labyrinth, and it's quite a thing to try to unpack, but it's so purposeful that she does not want you to follow the trail precisely. That's not the point. And I think to look at images which are do not fit the criteria of the traditional, beautiful, clear, and therefore so-called transparent image, that is something that's also very useful as a way of thinking about the world and interacting. The fact that the photographs she chooses from her family archive are, you think if you had a digital camera, someone might have deleted them. That they're like, what is this a photograph of? Not just like, these aren't purposefully off kilter and someone's cut off, but you think about, especially when you don't have a lot of photographs from your family's history, that you don't throw those away. Like even when you can't see who's there, you still hold on to that and keep it in the album. And I think that is really poignant.
So I think, as per the Counterfamily album by Les Exiliados, the strategies that they've used amply to preserve the identity of those who they consider to be the family are the absence of the images in the family album. I think that is probably the most obvious one, and not sharing them. In fact, if you go to their Instagram account, there's just a few number of images, and anywhere where you look into the internet, you won't see many more of what I've shown today. Yet I know for certain that they have plenty. Also, resources are obscuring the images, blurring them. That's also a strategy of remain opaque. And I think one of the things that is most important to their work is the conversations. And the conversations are held in Spanish. Most of them are recorded, and some of them have been shared online. So maintaining them in Spanish, which unfortunately is a colonial language, it also helps with this opacity of and preserving and protecting the privacy of the family of choice.
I spoke about not just 5 Guyanese women artists, but as you notice, in each of those 5 artists, they were all talking about Guyanese women too. So Guyanese women are the artists, they're also the subjects. So it's a complicated question for me to talk about Guyanese women and opacity, because largely Guyanese women are opaque, and that's what we're fighting against. I want to commend this convening because it's rare that you have 2 Guyanese women speakers, me and Faria. That doesn't happen to us quite often. And that is sort of anti-opaque, right? So it's a very tricky thing to be a Guyanese woman in the world and speaking about Guyanese women scholars and artists and thinkers, because we're trying to actually resist the opacity of us. So it's a complicated, there's good to opacity, and then there's some negatives to it as well. Faria is nodding, so she concurs.
I would like to open for questions because we have like not too much time, but if any of you want to contribute? No? Okay.
Okay, thank you for this another just stellar panel here, and I think I'm going to be also sitting with the fascinating curation of it, the way in which we're thinking opacity through the question, through objects and aesthetics of the familial. I think that's a really interesting point of thought for me, but I don't actually have a question. I was going to ask Heather to specifically just re-articulate your definition of generation, there was something really important in your formulation around that. And then perhaps if you would riff and tell us how you kind of come to that formulation, I would love to hear.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, I mean, I was attempting to riff on generation, and as I think Hewitt is visually, and to pull out these multiple resonances of that concept, right? So to tie it to familial generations, but also, and the generation, the proliferation, reproduction, dispersion of photography. And then from that, yet another prong to say that it is generative, right? That there is something about it that can give life to something more. So, so for me, that and thank you for bringing that up, because that is a key part of what I was trying to do, and I think you know, Hewitt's use of wood, for example, is such an eloquent way of summoning the notion of the generation, and simultaneously the opacity. You know, she speaks about the density of wood, so thinking about this weight, thinking about its solidity, its impermanence, and yet, right, all of the marks of time that it is subject to and how that changes it, and thinking about wood also as a life force, right? So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Any questions? Nina, you wanted to say something? I don't know.
Yeah. I just remarked that notably you, Grace, were giving many examples of matrilinear generations, and that also came up a lot in the panel before, in the conversation. So it's just an observation, and maybe to ask you to, well, maybe we come back rather to visibility though. Do you have some thoughts about, about this material? Yeah.
Well, about visibility, I've been sitting here the last 2 days, well, thinking about invisibility and being reminded of something powerful Toni Morrison said. She was in a conversation about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and she kind of took that book to task, and she asked this question just in response to Invisible Man, which, for those of you who don't know, it's a 1950s novel, a kind of very Afro-futurist novel about a black man living in Harlem that literally becomes invisible. And so he's walking through Harlem in an invisible state. And Toni Morrison says, invisible to who? Right? And so I keep that question with me when we're having conversations about invisibility, because I think what's more important is that we indict the gaze of invisibility. I think it's more important that we indict what is rendering a community invisible as opposed to naming a community invisible. To me, that is the work, is focusing on the gaze that makes that community invisible. And so I would just offer, as we have these conversations about invisibility, that we also ask the question, invisible to who?
I also consider important the notion that Raquel communicated at the end of her presentation regarding hypervisibility and how we saw that as well a little in the previous conversation, in the previous panel, but it's about sometimes how we may feel some kind of pressure around what we have to project or how we have to communicate our identities. So in that process, I think that that's another thing that we have to question or problematize. Another idea that for me is interesting in relationship with all of this discussion of opacities, of migration, and how, all these layers are being, and the liminal space, that is something that you address as well, Grace. How this notion of being in a liminal space contributes to this process of opacity. But I don't know, we had someone in the audience that wanted to say something? No? But, well, I think we are on time. Well, thank you so much, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The 2 days of the symposium come slightly to an end, so we are happy now to listen to the conclusions by Leslie King Haymond. Leslie King Haymond is a Professor Emerita, former Dean of Graduate Studies and founding director for the Center of Race and Culture at the Maryland Institute College of Arts. She sits on the boards of Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture, Baltimore Arts Reality Corporation, American Crafts Council, and the Collections Committee of the Walters Art Museum. She is an artist, curator, educator, art historical scholar, and cultural arts activist who has produced numerous publications, exhibitions, and projects highlighting the creative practices of women and artists of the Black Atlantic diaspora. And as mentioned before, she's also part of the advisory council of the program The Origin of Others, of which this symposium is part, and has participated in the conceptualization of the symposium 1 year before. So I'm very happy to have you here for the concluding remarks and making also the temporal link to a year before.
I have been so wrought with what to say. When I was first asked to give the closing remarks, I just, sure. And then I went, oh my God. The first thing I know that I had to do was to come and be hypersensitive to all the incredible presentations. I have been blessed to be part of the advisory board of The Origin of Others, which I thought was just a very bold, audacious, and essential move towards dealing with our histories. I am so happy to be part of WOPHA and to meet the incredible members of this group. Adente, you are just magnificent, and I applaud your efforts and hope that we can continue to work towards this. I am very gratified. I am extremely blessed and highly favored, as they would say in the church, to be in the company of women who take so seriously the importance and the gravity of this work. Each and every presentation has been nothing less than extraordinary. I applaud the Perez Museum, who has been the host for this, and Franklin Sermons, who was at one time, before he became the fearless leader of this institution, was one of my visiting critics in residence when I was in tenure at the Maryland Institute as a graduate dean. And I got a lot of grief for hiring Franklin Sermons because he was a black male. And they wanted to know, who was he? And I said, you wait and see. I also at the time had hired Hank Willis Thomas, Deborah Willis's son, to be a critic in residence for me. And so I was in a position to make impact in ways that was uncomfortable. And I loved the whole conversations that I heard about resistance. I was not necessarily compliant. I was called to the principal's office many times because I saw opportunities to move artists and initiatives and issues forward in ways which had not been dealt with before. Maryland Institute was founded in 1826, so we don't need to talk about colonialism. We talk about plantation culture. So I thought hard last night about how to kind of summarize, but also place into context my role. And I must face the reality. I am from that first generation of art historians, black art historians, who came forward in a time when we were not even supposed to be included in the landscape. My life, and for you to understand my role, my life, my experiences, as I make comment on things that I hope you will find resourceful and informative in shaping your practice, your research, your understandings, your hypersensitivity to all of these topics. I'm a child born into the civil rights movement. I came up in a working class family, most of whom had migrated from Barbados and Guyana. This was incredibly important in my upbringing because I began to understand the nature of culture, community, and family, and generations, because we had tiers of hierarchy within the family that we had to address. So all this conversation that we have been witnessing and hearing was already imbued in my psyche. Photography became the first visual impact in my life. Losing my innocence on the way to school, elementary school, seeing on a lamppost the photograph of the open casket of Emmett Till. Photography became a riveting moment for me, indelibly marked on my psyche and traumatizing me as a child, because I had no one at the time to talk about these things. I was already very interested in art and dealing with the dysfunctionalism of a world that I was witnessing, watching all of the things on a little TV screen, because you know TVs back in the day were about, the screens were this big. But I was glued to them because I could witness, I could see things happening within this new kind of media format. And so as I grew up, art became a salvation for me to escape the dysfunctionalisms of family and the disillusions of the world that I was growing up in as a girl who was not given the same privileges as her brother. So, what do you do? So I became a art maker, and when I was given time out, because I got called to the principal's house, in my house also, I would go to my room, and underneath my bed, I would pull out a box that my father had given me, which was a Cuban cigar box. He loved Cuban cigars when he could get them. And I would keep all my art stuff in there, and I would just make my art stuff and sort of soothe and heal myself in a safe place. I'm talking about these spaces that are safe spaces that women, no matter what age, define and mark as the place that they go to find a modicum of peace. I could not find peace in my household because I was a child, even though I was witnessing adult things that I did not agree with, but I had no voice. In the public, I had no voice. When I went to church, I had no voice. All right, so I'm trying to figure out how can I navigate this space. So I move forward in my life, and I find myself fighting to want to major in things that are meaningful to me, while the pressures of family and public are trying to channel me into occupations and decisions that are comfortable for everyone else but me. I'm going, no, I'm not having it. I'm weird. My cousins called me weird. My brother thought I was just a wank, all right? It was fine with me. I was comfortable figuring out who I was. I was born a very sick child. It was a cancer baby. I survived. And I figured, damn, if I survived cancer and a baby, I'm supposed to be doing something with my life. I have to have some purpose. I have to have some meaning. So, my family can't afford to send me to art school, so I use public arenas, after-school programs, Bible schools, churches, whatever was free, New York Times, summer camp, all right? All of these things, and I always went to the art, always went to the art. So I loved art making. Why? My grandmother, who had migrated from Barbados, was a master seamstress working in the garment district. My father, migrating from Barbados, was a master carpenter, was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard building battleships and submarines and aircraft carriers and anything that we needed in the house. And I loved to help him. My brother hated it. I love hanging sheetrock. I was just at this physicality for processing materials. So I find myself finally getting into an academic program, and I go to school and finally majoring in art. I'm just happy as my father builds me a little drawing area, and I'm like, okay, but I don't have a clue what I'm doing or where I'm going. I really don't, but I'm in a passion spot. So I'm following my instincts. My parents have just given up on me. They're just, you know, she's just going to be who she's going to be, all right? Just let her be, all right? So I get a fellowship. Finally, finish my BFA in painting, get a fellowship to work on a doctorate at Johns Hopkins University. Things started to change. My family just sort of turned on me. What are you doing? What are you trying to prove? We're not good enough? Where are you going with this doctorate thing? I don't know. Going to Baltimore. They gave me money. I'm going to use it. I arrive on Hopkins campus. The first group of affirmative action African American students on that campus in 100 years. There were about 50 of us, graduate and undergraduate. So my point is this: the first lesson I learned in survival, create a collective. And we all became a collective. In the day, this was the late 60s and the early 70s, there were very few women involved. I was an anomaly. But who was in school with me? Lowry Stokes Sims. She and I finished undergraduate school at Queens College, And then I convinced her to come to Johns Hopkins. Time for me to do my dissertation. They just did not get me. They did not like me. They did not like Lowry and I because we kept asking questions that went beyond modernism. Where are the women? Where are the people of color? Why are we constantly having to deal with the relentless attitudes of the rhetoric of patriarchies and colonialism and plantation culture? So Lowry and I, in grad school, we found a little line in the catalog that said we could do independent studies. So we created our own program. We created our own curriculums. We found scholars who were exceptional in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and we would travel every week. At City College, I said, Hopkins, you have given me this award. Then you failed to raise the money to continue my award, threw me out of school after I passed my field exams, and told me I could come back if I got a loan. So I got a lawyer and sued them, and won. All right, I won. President of the university said, this is ridiculous. All right? When I saw the president's wife and I was thanking him, she said, don't thank him, because she was a VP at a bank at the time. She said he was only doing what he was supposed to do. Do not thank him. I said, I'm sorry, I'll take it back. But I am happy to have my degree. So the first thing was I learned the power of a collective because all of the black students, male and female, we bonded together. We provided for each other a safe place, kinship, fellowship. But the other thing that we did, we learned each of their disciplines, all of their problems, all of their research. We all knew the progress, which informed us in ways at the time I didn't realize was going to help. All right. The next thing I learned was that as I became an art historian, there were too few of us. So then we developed a posse. We called ourselves a posse. So who was in my posse? There weren't a whole lot of people. Obviously, there was me, there was Lowry Sims, Deborah Willis, and Tritobia Hayes Benjamin, who was at Howard University and passed away, unfortunately, in 2014. Can I have the slide, please? Here's where my lessons with Deborah Willis became ever more important, because I was then able to have this conversation about the Till photographs with her. But at the time, Deborah was working at the Smithsonian, and she was doing an exhibition called Artist Scholar. And she had all these guys, David Driscoll and Ed Sorrells, Adewale. And she said, Leslie, she called me up. She said, Leslie, I don't have any women. I said, oh, and I'm trying to think. She said, who's an artist scholar? Who's an artist? And I don't know. She said, Leslie, you going to show? I said, no. Art has been my therapy. By this time, I had already been appointed dean of the graduate school, and I was really conflicted about perceptions of a competitiveness with the artists that I was hiring to work for me and artists that were emerging that I was teaching. And I said, just let me stay in the closet, okay? Then one day I'm going through a pile of stuff in my own personal archives, which looks like I'm a clutter bug, but that's what happens with archival research. And I find my self-portraits from when I'm 10 years old, when I had a moment, and I was studying at the Brooklyn Museum Art School, and Deb called me up. She said, we were always talking. She said, Leslie, what are you doing? I said, do you know I found my self-portraits? Not forgetting that she had wanted me to be in this show. And all of a sudden she screams at her husband, Leslie's in the show. She said, what day? I'm coming with my curatorial assistant. She comes into my house within 2 weeks, and she walks in the door, and I said, okay, let's go up to the 3rd floor, because I lived in a 19th century townhouse. She walks into my living room, and she says, what's that? This was an installation that I had contextualized and lived in my home. It's called Barbadian Spirits, altar for my grandmother, Adelise Maxwell. And here I have all of the things put together. On the walls on either side, I had embroideries from her sister, my grandmother's sister, and on the other side, I have the crochets from their first cousins. I had also started becoming obsessed with the works of unknown women. You know, you go to Goodwill or whatever, you know, flea market, and you see these gorgeous hand-embroidered and crocheted stuff, and families just throw them away. So I started collecting them. And I started to create in my living room this sanctuary, this sacred space, not realizing that it was informing my research, because often when I got tired or blocked in my research, I had to go back to making. I had to go back to the process. I had to physically get involved. So all of these words that you all are mentioning, these phrases, do you understand, are coming back and are absolutely critical to how we reclaim and identify our histories. Finally, I've decided to stay in Baltimore, Maryland, because I'm a native New Yorker, born in New York. And so, you know, New York is the only place that thinks it's a country. It's not part of the United States. You know, we are who we are. And I said, well, you know, if I stay in New York, I'm going to be poor. I won't be able to do what I want to do intellectually. I won't be able to have the support that I need. And I met two artists, really wild, whacked. The first one was John Waters. I don't know if you know him. Known in Baltimore as the Pope of Trash, okay? And he was doing very wild work, okay? Pink Flamingos and Mondo Trash Show and some of the most bizarre movies you can imagine. And I saw him in a thrift shop because I was there buying old crocheted lacy things, you know, and he's sitting there smoking and he's just talking. And I'm like, not eavesdropping, but I was definitely into what he was saying while I was paying for my goods. And I went, he is totally off the boards. Fascinating. 2 weeks later, I'm walking across Hopkins campus, and I see this black woman in an art festival wedged between tables, and I know she didn't pay her vendor's fee. And so I'm nosy, and I often say that I got a PhD because I'm nosy and I sort of like to get into people's business, but I had to kind of legitimize it in a way. And so I go over and I'm looking at her, and she has this big case, and she has all this jewelry that she's made out of unorthodox materials, pom-pom balls and cork and buttons and beads, you know. And I start to talk to her as I'm picking out the jewelry that I'm going to buy. And I said, you know, what are you doing? What is she says, oh, and she's wearing this wild wig. And she says, oh, you know, I have 5 children and I'm a single parent and I have to support them. And I looked at her and I said, she's in performance mode. So if you know anything about women's art of that period in the 70s, performance begins to emerge. So I said, okay. Another 2 weeks passed, sitting on the front step of my townhouse, my husband's washing his antique cars, and here comes this woman down the street, Joyce J. Scott. You can look her up. MacArthur Fellow, and I recommended her to the archives to be recorded. Became a MacArthur Fellow in 2016. And my husband looks up and he says, hi, Joyce. And I said, you know her? The rest is history, because I then became fast friends with her. And as a result, Joyce Scott created the second initiative that I recommend you do. And she founded what is called the Girls of Baltimore, which is an arts collective. We are 35 years working together. We started with 3 black women and 3 white women. We worked together because we were at a time in history We're having conversations about race, feminism, and all of these issues were extremely difficult, and we didn't have a safe place to talk. So this is how I began to inform my research. Because the other thing with my research is that I'm getting old, and I started out at a time where there was no Google, there was no Amazon, there was no Instagram, there was a card catalog. We had to do trench work. We had to go back to the bowels of how to find research. We had to use microfiche. And we had to go into institutions who were ill-prepared to deal with us, doing research on subjects that they made decisions, well, how can you do this? You're not supposed to be doing this, because they already had assumptions about what we were supposed to be capable of doing. This conference has provided for me, this symposium has provided me the opportunity to see what becomes of staying focused on your vision, to stay focused on your purpose. We encountered such enormous obstacles. And the irony for us now, many of us, is that even when I had the initial posse of Laurie Sims and Deb Willis and Tobia Hayes Benjamin, we did not leave behind those scholars who were geographically away from us. Lozetta Fowle Collins, who was on the West Coast, and Judith Wilson, also on the West Coast, and Frida Hive from the mid-region. We would call each other. If we could tell you the thousands of dollars we would spend in long-distance calls. But more importantly, we bonded with our other sisters. Sean Quick to C. Smith, who is now just really rising in the charts. Margaret Machida from the Asian community, who was doing this kind of research. And Amalia Mesa Baines from the Latina community. So this was the crew that fostered us, that we constantly knew each other's work, reached out, and we were relentless. We would call each other when we had projects. We would pass projects on to each other if we found that the other one had better specialties or skills, or we thought this was an opportunity. So I need for you women to understand that you need to work closely with each other and pass on these opportunities, looking for it, because the resistance is still prevalent, it is powerful, and it is working in very covert ways now. I have 1,000 issues here that I wanted to touch, but we've had 2 long days. So what I would like to say is that, one, I want people to think about the sacred spaces that women create for themselves, the archaeology of those spaces. I want you to have this phrase in your mind, in small things considered, which has to do with how material culture relates to the shaping of the identity and agency of women. Small things considered are those things that are broken, dismissed, sometimes dysfunctional, manufactured, ordinary, without class, without status, that are not necessarily beautiful. But when we look at women's lives, women have a way of taking these items and placing them together, as I have done in my installation here, to make meaning and purpose and to provoke memory like mnemonic devices as signifiers, to bring important elements of your substance, your being, your sense of who yourself is supposed to become. You need to be very, very sensitive to the language. The language is so riddled with colonialist ideologies, attitudes, biases. You have to think about words and verbiage and listen to your elders. Go talk to them. Do you understand? Because they will give you the messaging and the meanings that you need. And at many times throughout these presentations, we saw the presence of elders, of generations, intergenerational, families, and the importance of that impact. Spaces, I remember doing an installation once at a gallery, and I focused on the vanity as a space. Everyone in their home has a vanity. And as I was talking about my installation at a tea party held at this gallery in order to invite conversation from the community, there was a Jewish woman there, and she stood up and she started crying. And I said, "What is the matter?" She said, "Oh my God," she says, "you're talking about vanity." She said, "I just came from my mother's home in a assisted living," she said, "and she had just passed, and I took her vanity and threw everything away." So I had to console her by saying, now you know the importance of those items. Not that you had to save everything, but now you must be dependent upon your memory to recall those stories. Because if you pause and think about it, you will be able to retrieve them. So don't discount so many things that you will pass through when you are working in the spaces of women, which are very specifically designed to touch on the intimacies of our histories. I want to finally, and I want to wrap this up because I don't want to overturn my time, but there's another area that I've been working in order to validate my own sense of purpose in my own work. And that is I've been haunted by how I was trained in art history. Art historians, and you are so right, Allie, art historians are just so slow in academia. Do you understand? I want to know what kind of time warp they came out of, all right? They just did not envision the world, all right? They just did not have a sense of the humanity that comes with dealing with the arts. I remember beginning to teach, and I had no experience teaching art students, okay, who were constantly falling asleep, all right? So the question was, how do you keep them awake so that you can get a lesson across so that they will remember it, all right? So as I'm going through this process about learning how to teach, I am also going through the point of how am I going to connect this to a real world experience? So I learned how to teach in double voice. I learned how to teach in the voice of the period in which the work was worked. And then I would fast forward it into the time in which they lived so that they had a parallel experience. Once I started to do that, they started to wake up. And then the next thing was that as I developed this teaching style, the technology advanced and videos and digital media became possible. So I always included something from that media or photography so that I could stay connected to them. So you have to stay connected to the communities that you are trying to create an impact for. Symposiums. While we have talked about the art throughout these 2 days of symposiums, there is also the idea that there is more than just seeing or reading the picture visually. That we have to look at all of the senses, sensionics, okay? So we have to look at how a work is created, how it impacts, how it is related to the living experience, historically and in the present and in the future. And we took at it from how do we see it? How do we hear it? How do we smell it? How do we taste it? How do we feel it? What does it touch? What does it touch mean? Also, too, for women, what is the movement and or the juxtaposition of the body, all right? These are means and methods, strategies that women have used to convey messaging, to convey important information that where it might be lost in the archives, you can still retrieve it. Create a relationship with an archivist or an archival institution. They have endless resources. Even after you have finished your degrees, I maintain a relationship with the archivists that I work with in the libraries at Hopkins and at the Maryland Institute. Invaluable in providing you with materials that otherwise you had not thought about or did not know how to decode, deconstruct. They are the best. My last remarks in closing deal with more contemporaneous issues, and they have to deal with the truths and the realities of where we are now. I am sure that you all are aware of the innumerable instances that have come as a result of the fault lines of DEI. I hate DEI. Diversity, inclusion, and equity, or equity and inclusion, however you want to frame it. What this has done with a lot of cultural institutions is that it has forced them to look at the humongous gaps in the history of the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I'm talking about the tip of Argentina to all the way to the farthest coast of Canada. All right, we have gaps, chasms of information, of art, of experiences that have yet to be documented. They hire individuals of color. The institutions, unless they have prepared themselves properly, the staff, the board, and anyone else in the community, to accept what it is going to take to actually create change and transition. If they don't do that work properly, what we have noticed is that almost largely women are either resigning or being let go immediately. What this does is exacerbate what we call the weathering process. The wear and tear, the trauma that comes upon these women. No one is really talking or dealing with this in depth, and we must address it. Coming through this experience, I rolled from one project to the other. In my first generation of all of my colleagues, we suffered from this. We did not rest. Rest as resistance. Don't take it lightly. Take a breath, step back, sit down, get out of your own way, reboot. Do not let yourself become a casualty. Because many of these women now that we are dealing with, at least in the city of Baltimore, we are forming sister circles around them to support them. Because their trauma is our trauma. It is a reflection on all of our senses of integrity and the legitimacy of the work that we are doing. More than all of these women come with compelling credentials and then are caught in the crossfires, and we must find ways to be vigilant to protect them as we are doing our research, and also look at the people, the women that we are researching, to find out what were the traumas that they went through. Because as we understand those, we understand better how to do our research. Truths. Always maintain your truths. Don't let anyone ever steal your spirit. I learned to live with being wonky. I love being weird. It doesn't matter to me that you don't really understand me. Just know that I am not malevolent, that I am doing the work that I think is purposeful and meaningful. And finally, as I talk about rest as resistance, I also talk about the poetics of Black silence, indigenous silence. When I was granted this wonderful experience to go to Brazil, as a result of having met another scholar with AWARE at the Clark Arts Center. I moderated a panel with an Afro-Brazilian, Igor Simonas, and an indigenous woman. And then when it came time for the indigenous woman to present, we had on our translators because Portuguese was the language of the moment. And she's speaking and everyone is sort of nodding their heads. And then all of a sudden, no one is understanding a word. And this indigenous woman had gone right into her traditional language. And then she became silent. And she just moved, giving gestures and meanings. And I was like, oh, hot damn. That was a revelatory moment for me to pull all of this together. So I applaud you all. I support you all. Whatever resources that I have or information or connections are yours. We don't own history. And that's the thing that colonialism has taught me. They want to hold, they want to dismember, they want to recreate it in their own image to our disadvantage. Do not let them do it, because the power is in our collective union and commitment to each other. Thank you so much.